Good evening, gentle souls seeking slumber. Tonight, we journey not through tales of kings and queens, nor through the musings of great thinkers, but into something far more intricate and perilous. The labyrinth of love in medieval times, for finding romance amid plagues, dowry negotiations, and the ever-vigilant eyes of chaperones, proved somehow more awkward than our modern custom of sending midnight messages asking you awake. In the Middle Ages, romance wasn't about butterflies and longing gazes, but rather the calculated exchange of property deeds. From the elaborate theater of courtly love to marriages sealed with livestock transactions, matters of the heart were complex affairs governed by rigid social protocols. Before we begin our historical slumber journey, I invite you to offer your appreciation with a like and subscription, only if my tales truly bring you comfort. I'm curious, from which corner of the world are you listening, and what hour shows on your timepiece? Now, lower your lights, perhaps start a gentle fan for soothing white noise, and let us drift together into medieval romance. Picture yourself in a medieval village, or within the cold stone walls of a castle, wondering how one might find a companion for life. Perhaps you consider approaching someone, complimenting their well-crafted leggings, or inquiring if they frequent this particular marketplace. However, courtship in medieval society followed entirely different rules. In medieval times, dating as we understand it today simply didn't exist. There were no flirtatious exchanges, no passed notes, no romantic walks to see where feelings might lead. Instead, your parents, feudal lord, or even your religious superior would likely have predetermined your marital destiny, including both the wedding date and precisely how many cattle would finalize the arrangement. For nobility, betrothals commonly occurred before puberty had even completed its work. You and your intended might first glimpse each other on your actual wedding day, a situation as awkward as one might imagine. These arrangements weren't about compatibility or shared interests, but centered on land titles and strategic family alliances. Commoners experienced slightly less formal circumstances, though only marginally so. Your family still wielded considerable influence, and personal preference rarely entered consideration. Perhaps your parents knew a maiden whose family owned a particularly fertile goat, or they admired a young man skilled at roof thatching without fatal accidents. Thus began your courtship. Count yourself blessed. This isn't to suggest medieval people couldn't experience romantic feelings. They absolutely did. However, romance took second place to more pressing matters: survival, inheritance, and maintaining social order. Falling in love before marriage was considered unwise. Falling in love outside of marriage was scandalous. Both earned disapproval, unless you happened to be immortalized in tragic poetry, where passionate indulgence was permissible. Yet, even within these constraints, hearts still yearned. Perhaps you scribbled verses on scraps of parchment, or exchanged furtive glances across the marketplace. Perhaps you developed feelings for someone not pre-approved by your family's livestock appraiser. But patience and obedience were the virtues of the day. You tried not to become enamored with the miller's apprentice, for in this world, while love might inspire poets, marriage remained firmly in the domain of parents, priests, and politics. So you found someone appealing. Perhaps it's their skillful balancing of an onion basket upon their head, or the confident manner in which they beat dust from rugs. Your medieval heart quickens, but steady yourself, for in this world, romance blooms not without proper financial accounting. Before contemplating courtship, one must honestly assess What assets do I bring to this arrangement? If your answer is merely a charming personality, prepare for disappointment. Young men needed land, livestock, tools, or, at minimum, a roof that didn't leak too severely. Love letters might be pleasant, but nothing communicated husband material like 2 healthy oxen and weather-resistant housing. If your father had already promised the prize goat to your brother, perhaps religious life deserved consideration. For young women, your family needed to provide a dowry, perhaps coins, clothing, or an impressively abundant flock of geese. Your wit and charm meant little if your family couldn't provide adequate payment. In such cases, you might spend considerable time perfecting your needlework in solitude. Imagine actually developing feelings for someone who makes your work-worn heart beat faster. You exchange glances at the village well. There's an undeniable spark. It's romantic, poetic, and completely irrelevant unless your families occupy similar financial brackets. For those of noble birth, circumstances grew even more complicated. Your hand in marriage was inextricably linked to territorial boundaries and political advantages. You represented not merely a person, but a walking peace treaty. Even peasants weren't exempt from such practicalities. Marriage wasn't about romantic sentiments, but pragmatic considerations. You wed because your pig enclosure conveniently bordered someone else's wheat field. You might dream of passion while settling for shared irrigation rights. Nevertheless, one persisted. Perhaps you offered modest tokens, a hand-carved wooden spoon, freshly gathered forest berries, or your finest slightly chipped drinking vessel. Whether they smiled in response or not, the truth remained. In medieval courtship, economics constituted the primary language of flirtation, and love was merely a potential bonus one hoped might eventually develop. Consider now a different scenario. You're neither a peasant concerned with livestock, nor a noble navigating political alliances. Perhaps you're a knight with gleaming armor, an impressive steed, and questionable poetic abilities. What form might your romantic pursuits take? Welcome to the peculiar and emotionally exhausting realm of courtly love. This wasn't courtship in any recognizable sense, but rather an elaborate performance art. Courtly love represented a noble pastime combining flirtation, spiritual suffering, and thoroughly impractical sentiments. As a valiant knight in medieval society, you participated in the exquisite dance of courtly love, an art form. So refined it transformed romantic yearning into spiritual devotion. Your object of affection, a noble lady, typically married to another lord, whom you worshipped from an appropriate distance. Physical proximity would shatter the delicate illusion. The very power of courtly love lay in its unfulfilled nature. Your devotion manifested through elaborate gestures of poetic suffering. You might compose verses comparing her laughter to celestial music, or her hair to sunbeams dancing across morning meadows, seemingly poetic. But in medieval reality, simply acknowledging she existed and hadn't publicly disparaged your ancestral line. During tournaments, her colors adorned your armor like sacred vestments. You perfected the art of the dramatic sigh when she entered the great hall, and occasionally challenged fellow knights to combat for the grievous sin of gazing too admiringly in her direction. The noble lady played her role with calculated precision, her performance requiring the emotional restraint of a mountain glacier. She acknowledged your devotions with the slightest of nods, perhaps sending a carefully worded letter or bestowing a token ribbon, but always maintaining her essential quality, unattainability. Like a star too distant to touch, yet bright enough to navigate by, she remained forever beyond reach. This exquisitely choreographed ritual thrived on minimal contact. Perhaps during a feast, your eyes met briefly across the hall, or her fingers whispered against your gauntlet, while passing a goblet, fleeting moments immortalized in your heart for months. Anything more explicit risked transforming courtly devotion into scandalous reality, adulteria, transgression neither party officially desired, regardless of private sentiments. The beauty of courtly love lay in its theatrical understanding. All participants recognized it as a sanctioned channel for expressing profound emotions without threatening social structures. It served as an emotional release valve in a society where passion was otherwise tightly controlled. The theatricality cannot be overstated. Was it dramatic? As dramatic as a summer thunderstorm. Did it elevate poetic sentiment over practicality with unwavering dedication? Yet for nights balancing battlefield horrors with castle monotony, courtly love provided both creative inspiration and emotional purpose, though one wisely never expected it to culminate in genuine happiness, physical affection, or even sustained eye contact. Having discovered genuine feelings for someone, albeit slower, infinitely more confusing, and perpetually misinterpreted. Imagine yourself as a knight, hopelessly enamored with Lady Marjorie, of wherever her ancestral lands might be. Direct conversation proves impossible due to constant surveillance, and your poetic compositions keep finding their way into her spiritual advisor's disapproving hands. What options remain? Perhaps sending a glove or embroidered sleeve, nothing declares. Undying devotion, quite like dispatching random articles of clothing. As recipient of such a token, congratulations on your newfound possession. One slightly worn linen sleeve, carrying the faint aroma of its previous owner, and the immense social burden of interpreting its meaning. Does this fabric rectangle represent undying love? A request for favor, a challenge to armed combat? The ambiguity is both maddening and entirely intentional. Women bestowed tokens, as well a ribbon woven with her own hands, a carefully preserved lock of hair, or a small pendant blessed during private prayers. While seemingly innocent, these exchanges carried profound implications. The wrong token given to the wrong recipient could inadvertently forge matrimonial expectations with someone whose facial features resembled an asymmetrical root vegetable and whose drinking habits alarmed even the local tavern keeper. These tokens required subtlety in display: a glove discreetly pinned to your chest beneath your cloak, her ribbon bound to your sword hilt during private moments of contemplation. Everyone recognized their significance while maintaining the social fiction of ignorance. This embroidered handkerchief bearing her family crest? No, certainly not. From Lady Jonette, mysteriously appeared among my possessions, perfumed with lavender. Mere coincidence, I assure you. Common folk practiced simpler token exchanges, perhaps wooden carvings, whittled during rare moments of rest, or handkerchiefs stitched by candlelight after endless hours of agricultural labor. The sentiment remained equally profound, if somewhat more calloused and hastened. These tokens, for all their romantic significance, carried genuine risk. Gifting to an inappropriate recipient could ignite whispered rumors that spread faster than plague. Receiving an unwanted token presented its own diplomatic challenge. How does one politely return? Yet, despite these social complications, tokens served as powerful symbols of affection In a world where opportunities for romantic expression were severely limited by both church and custom, you finally gather your courage to approach your beloved, perhaps offering a freshly picked wildflower or reciting poetry that suspiciously resembles a traveling minstrel's latest ballad. As you prepare for this intimate moment, reality strikes. You're never truly alone. Welcome to the elaborate surveillance system of medieval romance, where every loving glance is monitored by your mother, the parish priest, your unusually interested cousin, and sometimes all three, simultaneously watching from barely concealed positions. For young women of marriageable age, the concept of solitary existence was as foreign as modern plumbing. Your posture might single-handedly bring about society's collapse. Even mundane tasks, like filling water jugs at the well, occurred under watchful eyes, always watching, always judging. Courtship resembled an elaborate game of espionage rather than the pursuit of genuine connection. Men fared no better in this romantic landscape. Success in courtship required navigating a labyrinthine approval system, including her immediate family, extended relatives, religious authorities, and the village's informal intelligence network of gossips. Arriving, hopefully, at her home with flowers clutched in sweating hands, you'd discover her father mysteriously sharpening farming implements just within earshot, her mother stirring an empty pot with suspicious vigor, and the village priest who had coincidentally chosen this precise moment for pastoral visits despite the sun clearly setting. The underlying rationale for this extensive chaperoning system was crystalline in its simplicity: protect virtue, preserve family reputation, and prevent any physical contact whatsoever, particularly before marriage, especially when unaccompanied, absolutely, under all circumstances imaginable, no exceptions, not even one. Chaperones hovered over every interaction, from group excursions, bench permitted only when separated by precisely calculated distances, and under the watchful gaze of someone's grandmother, pretending to focus on her knitting, while cataloging every exchanged glance. The Church's role in regulating romantic entanglements cannot be overstated. Priests delivered passionate sermons on proper conduct with the same fervor they reserved for deadly sins. Clergymen composed elaborate treatises concerning flirtations, dangers with painstaking attention to detail, hunched over parchment by flickering candlelight, copying these warnings while brothers in nearby alcoves silently judged their penmanship and moral fortitude. Even private correspondence fell under scrutiny. Some monasteries intercepted love letters specifically to review their moral content, divine surveillance at its most efficient. This meant romantic pursuits required accepting constant observation, not just by one's extended family, but potentially by the Almighty Himself, who apparently had nothing better to do than monitor your awkward attempts at courtship. So you've fallen in love, or at least experienced the medieval version, an uncomfortable mixture of longing, confusion, and spending excessive time gazing pensively through windows. Perhaps you've exchanged meaningful glances across crowded feast tables, or they retrieved your dropped handkerchief without immediately treating it as contaminated. The emotional tension becomes unbearable. Yet expressing these feelings remains impossible with omnipresent chaperones, clergy, and mothers materializing like specters whenever romance threatened to bloom. One option remained: the secret love letter, parchment more dangerous than formal excommunication notices. Here was your opportunity to bare your soul through excessively ornate language. Direct statements like "I find you appealing" were replaced by florid declarations, My soul wanders the forests of yearning, like a stag pierced by the arrow of your grace, bleeding poetry with each step taken toward your distant light, assuming both parties possessed the rare gift of literacy. You would carefully inscribe your message on precious vellum or coarse parchment. The truly dedicated might enhance their missive with flower petals or delicate perfume, though caution remained essential. Historical records tell of one unfortunate noble who accidentally wrapped a herring in his love letter before delivering it to the wrong maiden. They eventually married. The story apparently ended well enough. Delivery presented its own challenges. Direct handover remained impossible. You required a trusted intermediary, perhaps a loyal servant, a monk susceptible to bribery, or a younger sibling, blissfully unaware of potential consequences. Occasionally, traveling minstrels served this function, publicly performing your poetic sentiments while maintaining the thinnest veneer of anonymity. The height of medieval subtlety. The poetry itself carried significant risks, the boundary separating romantic expression from potential. Heresy proved thinner than a monk's patience during extended fasting periods. Should your metaphors even hint at physical attraction, you might find yourself confessing both lustful thoughts and literary exaggeration during your next church visit. Despite these formidable obstacles, people continued writing. Some letters survived. Certain poems were copied and circulated like forbidden treasures in a world defined by rigid regulations and constant surveillance. A simple folded page containing heartfelt words represented revolutionary defiance. So you wrote, risked judgment, pressed trembling fingers to parchment, and expressed everything forbidden in spoken conversation, though wisely refraining from signing too clearly. You sought romance, not ecclesiastical prosecution. Finally came blessed reprieve, feast days, harvest festivals, or maypole dances. These rare occasions temporarily transformed existence from endless labor, prayer, and pretending complete disinterest in the blacksmith's daughter. During these sanctioned celebrations, flirtation became briefly permissible, provided either nobody witnessed it or everybody witnessed but collectively maintained the polite fiction of ignorance. Welcome to medieval festivals, where romance blossomed under the watchful eyes of everyone you'd ever encountered and several curious farm animals. These gatherings represented rare, socially sanctioned opportunities for men and women to mingle, laugh, and daringly make prolonged eye contact. Musicians played energetically, ale flowed generously, and someone inevitably wore a flower crown with dangerous confidence. Never had you witnessed so many people temporarily abandoning their habitual pretense of misery. Peasants might impress potential partners through competitive activities, winning sack races, successfully capturing greased pigs, or juggling stale bread without dropping it. Nothing communicated romantic availability quite like tumbling dramatically from a hay bale, while somehow maintaining one's dignity. Dancing offered the most promising opportunity for actual physical contact, though rigid rules remained in force. Well-timed spins or seemingly accidental hand grazes conveyed more meaning than the most elaborate poetry. The maypole dance essentially provided a massive public excuse for coordinated flirtation, thinly disguised by colorful ribbons and plausible deniability. Noble flirtation at festivals involved considerably less hay, but significantly more poetry. You might spontaneously compose verses, comparing your lady's eyes to twin candles or other suitably luminous objects, offering trinkets, hopefully not visibly crafted by servants, moments earlier. Food facilitated interaction, offering carefully selected meat pies or sharing honey cakes represented bold romantic overtures. If received with smiles, you could cautiously celebrate progress. If fed to nearby dogs, perhaps reconsider your romantic prospects entirely. Throughout these interactions, vigilant observers remained omnipresent. Watchful parents, concerned religious figures, and bards whose loose tongues could transform innocent exchanges into salacious tales faster than a court jester's quickest jest. A single misstep could transform an innocent, flirtatious smile into scandalous impropriety, destined to be dissected during church gatherings for weeks thereafter. Nevertheless, these fleeting festival hours offered precious reprieve, allowing participants to imagine, however briefly, a world where love transcended mere transaction, where genuine laughter wasn't viewed with immediate suspicion, and where public dancing didn't inevitably conclude with assigned penance. For the common villager, neither knight nor noble nor bard with a lute and excessive sentimentality, romance assumed an entirely different character, rising with roosters and retiring with chickens, spending days ankle-deep in mud. Practical concerns naturally dominated. You weren't seeking a poetic soulmate who could compose sonnets about your eyebrows. You desired someone who could milk a goat efficiently without unnecessary dramatics. In peasant courtship, romance manifested through practicality, modest gestures, and chemistry defined primarily by mutual survival through winter's harshest months. In this earthbound reality, dating revolved less around extended conversations about feelings and more about shared labor and compatible skills. Attraction developed toward those who demonstrated diligence, complained sparingly about blisters, and possessed a reasonably complete set of teeth, essentially the medieval equivalent of an impressive dating profile. Practicality reigned supreme. Emotional fireworks represented unnecessary luxuries, when what you truly required was someone capable of gutting fish efficiently, while maintaining a tolerable snoring volume that wouldn't wake the entire household. Expressions of interest came through practical gifts, a carefully woven basket filled with unbroken eggs, a thoughtfully bundled stack of particularly dry firewood, or perhaps a surprisingly impressive turnip. For the truly smitten, bolder offerings might include a hand-woven ribbon, or, most telling of all, a wooden spoon painstakingly carved during precious evening hours by candlelight under the seemingly judgmental gaze of one's livestock. Conversations blossomed during communal tasks, walking together to the mill, tending sheep side by side, or exchanging pleasantries while shoveling questionable-smelling substances into garden plots. Rather than flowery poetry about eternal devotion, discussions centered on weather patterns, anticipated crop yields, and whether old Thomas had once again fallen into the village well. Yet despite this apparent simplicity, genuine romance emerged, a special sweetness found in shared purpose, a partnership built not on idealistic notions, but on practical cooperation, knowing each other's strengths, weaknesses, and relative sprinting capabilities when pursuing escaped goats across muddy fields. Proposals often proceeded with remarkable efficiency. Upon mutual agreement and familial approval, marriage quickly followed with minimal ceremony. Perhaps you moved into a shared dwelling, or perhaps you constructed a new one with communal village assistance. You contributed your finest blanket. They brought a goat or two. Together, you embarked upon the curious miracle of domestic survival. Unglamorous perhaps, but honest. Success meant finding someone capable of cooking, cleaning, tolerating your relatives, and maintaining composure when confronted with your unshod feet after long summer days. Medieval true love indeed. Marriage, in medieval terms, represented not a dreamy vow exchanged beneath starlight, but a binding contract negotiated with all the romance of a particularly tense livestock auction. Even for peasants, it constituted a significant occasion, gathering witnesses, consulting the local priest, and attempting not to stumble over unfamiliar Latin phrases during the ceremony. Beneath seemingly sweet blessings lay serious considerations: dowry arrangements, land rights, livestock ownership, and contingency plans should someone perish during planting season. For the nobility, marriage transformed into full-scale legal negotiation, resembling modern corporate mergers. Parents from both families, priests, scribes, and perhaps a cousin with rudimentary legal knowledge, all participated in exhaustive discussions, while bride and groom stood decoratively nearby, nodding when addressed, and occasionally wondering whom exactly they were marrying. Prior acquaintance with one's betrothed remained entirely optional. What mattered was the mathematical calculation. Your estate required her fields, her dowry balanced your debts, and your respective family coats of arms complemented each other aesthetically when displayed on banners. Love remained optional. The merger was absolutely non-negotiable. Once married, permanence prevailed with iron certainty. Divorce existed conceptually, but remained practically unattainable unless one could prove a spouse was unbaptized, secretly related within prohibited degrees, or deceased yet neglectfully uncommunicative about this condition. Annulments technically existed, but demanded extensive documentation, extraordinarily fortuitous circumstances, and substantial bribes to relevant authorities. Beyond the stark practicalities, medieval marriage often revealed unexpected warmth. Many couples cultivated genuine affection through the shared tapestry of daily life, tending children, laboring side by side, and huddling together through winter's bitter embrace. These ordinary challenges forged bonds of authentic connection, or, at minimum, a comfortable familiarity that medieval sensibilities recognized as nearly indistinguishable from love. The Church cast its shadow across every aspect. Marriage stood among the 7 holy sacraments, elevated in sacred significance. You wed not merely for earthly contracts, but because divine law demanded witnesses, preferably to menso. And so you stood before God, exchanged sacred promises, and smiled graciously as someone presented a humble sack of onions, somehow transformed by blessing into a token of divine favor. Yet within this structured world, rebellion flickered like candle flames against darkness. Among nobility especially, defying family-arranged matches for love-inspired unions represented a revolutionary act of breathtaking audacity. Noble elopements were the medieval equivalent of deliberately torching one's ancestral lineage, while dancing with wild abandon among the embers. To abscond with a partner of personal choosing constituted not merely romantic defiance, but an act of political insurrection. Picture Lady Eleonora, betrothed through careful negotiation to Lord Sigismund von Estates, secure, whose lands conveniently bordered her father's. Yet fate intervened when she encountered a penniless squire whose scent mingled horse and leather with intoxicating promise of adventure. After stolen moments in shadowed stables and whispered devotions beneath starlight, they vanished to a remote monastery where a sympathetic abbot who owed her father a considerable debt, yet valued romance slightly more, agreed to officiate. There they exchanged sacred vows under dubious canonical circumstances, with only a visibly trembling monk and 2 spectacularly unimpressed chickens bearing witness. Meanwhile, their families erupted in magnificent chaos. Fathers threatening siege upon modest gardens, mothers collapsing dramatically into embroidery frames, clergy expressing profound theological concerns, and villagers savoring every delicious morsel of scandal. For the audacious groom in such forbidden romance, comfort proved elusive. Best outcome, retaining both his bride and his kneecaps intact. Worst scenario, formal excommunication promptly followed by expertly administered disembowelment, precisely in that sequence. Yet, occasionally, these star-crossed lovers successfully navigated treacherous waters between family, honor, and heart's desire. When marriages proved impossible to annul without generating further embarrassment, families sometimes grudgingly accepted accomplished facts. After all, what was done could not be undone, and at least no one had perished in the process. Presumably, in rare instances, these scandals transformed into cultural touchstones, immortalized in minstrels' songs, poets' verses, and hushed tales exchanged at royal banquets. 2 nobles, choosing love's uncertain path over duty's well-worn road, became almost mythological figures. Though most aristocratic marriages remained fundamentally contractual arrangements, these occasional rebellions, passionate escapes, fervent vows exchanged beneath moonlit tower windows, reminded a pragmatic world that love, however inconvenient, stubbornly refused to vanish entirely. So when modern romantic disappointments weigh heavily, consider this perspective. At least your romantic misfortunes rarely involve clandestine weddings, enraged barons, and nervous horses tethered beneath bedchamber windows, awaiting hasty midnight departures. Medieval marriage represented that sublime union of 2 souls, alongside their meticulously inventoried financial assets. While love offered a pleasant aesthetic consideration, dowries constituted the true romantic currency. As a bride, you weren't merely entering matrimony. You were being launched like a small, carefully provisioned economic vessel. Your family assembled your dowry with calculated precision: currency, livestock, land parcels, household linens, perhaps several cows calibrated to your perceived marriageability, and possibly even pewter tableware if they felt especially optimistic about your prospects. These assembled goods transferred directly to your future husband's control, who received both your person and portable wealth with practiced gratitude and mental arithmetic already well underway. In certain cultures and regions, the exchange operated in reverse, rather than the bride's family providing goods. The groom paid a bride price directly to her family, effectively declaring, "Please accept this horse, finely woven cloak, and trio of pedigreed pigs as fair exchange for your daughter's hand." Medieval romance, expressed through exquisite economic precision. The fundamental principle remained consistent throughout variations. Someone compensated someone else. Marriage subsequently occurred, and elaborately detailed documentation recorded the transaction. These exchanges represented far more than simple wealth transfer. They constituted public declarations of status and family standing. A substantial dowry proclaimed a bride's prestigious connections. A notably meager offering might suggest hasty familial divestment, possibly due to concerning personality traits or troubling tendency toward questioning male authority. As the bride, you seldom maintained independent control over your dowry after marriage. It became seamlessly incorporated into the household economy under your husband's management. Theoretically protected by law, and hopefully not squandered on dice games and overpriced ale within the first month of matrimony. Should your marriage conclude through death, annulment, or your husband's unexpected midlife spiritual crisis culminating in monastic vows, your dowry could theoretically revert to your possession, though retrieving it often proved more challenging than extracting Excalibur from stone. Success required substantial support, legal advocacy, and preferably someone capable of reading contractual Latin. Meanwhile, bride prices functioned remarkably like purchasing exotic livestock, expensive initially and accompanied by stringent no-return policies. The payment primarily compensated the bride's family for her labor loss from their household. After all, who would now milk the sheep, tend the garden, and manage the countless domestic tasks? While love occasionally factored into these arrangements, money invariably attended the ceremonial altar as honored guest. For those deliberately avoiding marriage altogether, perhaps as second sons with limited inheritance prospects, recipients of suspiciously modest dowry offers, or individuals genuinely enthusiastic about pre-dawn liturgical chanting, monasteries and convents offered alternative life paths. Upon joining these cloistered communities, you accepted solemn vows of poverty, chastity, and determined disinterest in romantic entanglements. Yet, even within stone walls permeated with silence, incense, and Brother Anselm's unexpectedly soulful gaze across the chapter house, forbidden love occasionally blossomed against all spiritual intentions. To be absolutely clear, romantic entanglements within religious orders faced severe institutional disapproval, potentially resulting in physical discipline, permanent exile, or interminable lectures from individuals with impressively intimidating Latin appellations. You had sworn to dedicate your heart entirely to divine contemplation, theoretically leaving no capacity for earthly attachments. Yet hearts proved remarkably rebellious against theological constraints, and occasionally morning prayers began suspiciously resembling love poetry with thinly disguised religious metaphors. Perhaps such forbidden attraction began innocently enough, passing bread during communal meals, whispering clarifications during evening prayers, laughing with inappropriate enthusiasm when someone fumbled their hymnal during midnight services. Before fully recognizing what transpired, you found yourself secretly tucking extra cheese into Sister Beatrice's satchel and questioning everything you once believed about spiritual dedication. Some particularly daring monks and nuns exchanged passionate correspondence, carefully disguised as theological ruminations. They crafted letters filled with cleverly disguised passion beneath religious terminology. Your soul shines with radiance, illuminating my darkest contemplations, appears perfectly devout, till one reads between carefully composed lines, which many ecclesiastical authorities eventually learned to do. In this earthbound reality, dating revolved less around extended conversations about feelings and more about shared labor and compatible skills. Attraction developed toward those who demonstrated diligence, complained sparingly about blisters, and possessed a reasonably complete set of teeth, essentially the medieval equivalent of an impressive dating profile. Practicality reigned supreme. Emotional fireworks represented unnecessary luxuries, when what you truly required was someone capable of gutting fish efficiently, while maintaining a tolerable snoring volume that wouldn't wake the entire household. Expressions of interest came through practical gifts, a carefully woven basket filled with unbroken eggs, a thoughtfully bundled stack of particularly dry firewood, or perhaps a surprisingly impressive turnip. For the truly smitten, bolder offerings might include a hand-woven ribbon, or, most telling of all, a wooden spoon painstakingly carved during precious evening hours by candlelight under the seemingly judgmental gaze of one's livestock. Conversations blossomed during communal tasks, walking together to the mill, tending sheep side by side, or exchanging pleasantries while shoveling questionable-smelling substances into garden plots. Rather than flowery poetry about eternal devotion, discussions centered on weather patterns, anticipated crop yields, and whether old Thomas had once again fallen into the village well. Yet despite this apparent simplicity, genuine romance emerged, a special sweetness found in shared purpose, a partnership built not on idealistic notions, but on practical cooperation, knowing each other's strengths, weaknesses, and relative sprinting capabilities when pursuing escaped goats across muddy fields. Proposals often proceeded with remarkable efficiency. Upon mutual agreement and familial approval, marriage quickly followed with minimal ceremony. Perhaps you moved into a shared dwelling, or perhaps you constructed a new one with communal village assistance. You contributed your finest blanket. They brought a goat or two. Together, you embarked upon the curious miracle of domestic survival. Unglamorous, perhaps, but honest. Success meant finding someone capable of cooking, cleaning, tolerating your relatives, and maintaining composure when confronted with your unshod feet after long summer days. Medieval true love indeed. Marriage, in medieval terms, represented not a dreamy vow exchanged beneath starlight, but a binding contract negotiated with all the romance of a particularly tense livestock auction. Even for peasants, it constituted a significant occasion, gathering witnesses, consulting the local priest, and attempting not to stumble over unfamiliar Latin phrases during the ceremony. Beneath seemingly sweet blessings lay serious considerations, dowry arrangements, land rights, livestock ownership, and contingency plans should someone perish during planting season. For the nobility, marriage transformed into full-scale legal negotiation resembling modern corporate mergers. Parents from both families, priests, scribes, and perhaps a cousin with rudimentary legal knowledge, all participated in exhaustive discussions, while bride and groom stood decoratively nearby, nodding when addressed, and occasionally wondering whom exactly they were marrying. Prior acquaintance with one's betrothed remained entirely optional. What mattered was the mathematical calculation. Your estate required her fields, her dowry balanced your debts, and your respective family coats of arms complemented each other aesthetically when displayed on banners. Love remained optional. The merger was absolutely non-negotiable. Once married, permanence prevailed with iron certainty. Divorce existed conceptually, but remained practically unattainable unless one could prove a spouse was unbaptized, secretly related within prohibited degrees, or deceased yet neglectfully uncommunicative about this condition. Annulments technically existed, but demanded extensive documentation, extraordinarily fortuitous circumstances, and substantial bribes to relevant authorities. Beyond the stark practicalities, medieval marriage often revealed unexpected warmth. Many couples cultivated genuine affection through the shared tapestry of daily life, tending children, laboring side by side, and huddling together through winter's bitter embrace. These ordinary challenges forged bonds of authentic connection, or, at minimum, a comfortable familiarity that medieval sensibilities recognized as nearly indistinguishable from love. The Church cast its shadow across every aspect. Marriage stood among the 7 holy sacraments, elevated in sacred significance. You wed not merely for earthly contracts, but because divine law demanded witnesses, preferably to menso. And so you stood before God, exchanged sacred promises, and smiled graciously as someone presented a humble sack of onions, somehow transformed by blessing into a token of divine favor. Yet within this structured world, rebellion flickered like candle flames against darkness. Among nobility especially, defying family-arranged matches for love-inspired unions represented a revolutionary act of breathtaking audacity. Noble elopements were the medieval equivalent of deliberately torching one's ancestral lineage, while dancing with wild abandon among the embers. To abscond with a partner of personal choosing constituted not merely romantic defiance, but an act of political insurrection. Picture Lady Eleonora, betrothed through careful negotiation to Lord Sigismund von Estates, secure, whose lands conveniently bordered her father's. Yet fate intervened when she encountered a penniless squire whose scent mingled horse and leather with intoxicating promise of adventure. After stolen moments in shadowed stables and whispered devotions beneath starlight, they vanished to a remote monastery where a sympathetic abbot who owed her father a considerable debt, yet valued romance slightly more, agreed to officiate. There they exchanged sacred vows under dubious canonical circumstances, with only a visibly trembling monk and two spectacularly unimpressed chickens bearing witness. Meanwhile, their families erupted in magnificent chaos. Fathers threatening siege upon modest gardens, mothers collapsing dramatically into embroidery frames, clergy expressing profound theological concerns, and villagers savoring every delicious morsel of scandal. For the audacious groom in such forbidden romance, comfort proved elusive. Best outcome, retaining both his bride and his kneecaps intact. Worst scenario, formal excommunication promptly followed by expertly administered disembowelment, precisely in that sequence. Yet, occasionally, these star-crossed lovers successfully navigated treacherous waters between family, honor, and heart's desire. When marriages proved impossible to annul without generating further embarrassment, families sometimes grudgingly accepted accomplished facts. After all, what was done could not be undone, and at least no one had perished in the process. Presumably, in rare instances, these scandals transformed into cultural touchstones, immortalized in minstrels' songs, poets' verses, and hushed tales exchanged at royal banquets. Two nobles, choosing love's uncertain path over duty's well-worn road, became almost mythological figures. Though most aristocratic marriages remained fundamentally contractual arrangements, these occasional rebellions, passionate escapes, fervent vows exchanged beneath moonlit tower windows, reminded a pragmatic world that love, however inconvenient, stubbornly refused to vanish entirely. So when modern romantic disappointments weigh heavily, consider this perspective. At least your romantic misfortunes rarely involve clandestine weddings, enraged barons, and nervous horses tethered beneath bedchamber windows, awaiting hasty midnight departures. Medieval marriage represented that sublime union of two souls, alongside their meticulously inventoried financial assets, while love offered a pleasant aesthetic consideration. Dowries constituted the true romantic currency. As a bride, you weren't merely entering matrimony. You were being launched like a small, carefully provisioned economic vessel. Your family assembled your dowry with calculated precision: currency, livestock, land parcels, household linens, perhaps several cows calibrated to your perceived marriageability, and possibly even pewter tableware if they felt especially optimistic about your prospects. These assembled goods transferred directly to your future husband's control, who received both your person and portable wealth with practiced gratitude and mental arithmetic already well underway. In certain cultures and regions, the exchange operated in reverse, rather than the bride's family providing goods. The groom paid a bride price directly to her family, effectively declaring, "Please accept this horse, finely woven cloak, and trio of pedigreed pigs as fair exchange for your daughter's hand." Medieval romance, expressed through exquisite economic precision. The fundamental principle remained consistent throughout variations. Someone compensated someone else. Marriage subsequently occurred, and elaborately detailed documentation recorded the transaction. These exchanges represented far more than simple wealth transfer. They constituted public declarations of status and family standing. A substantial dowry proclaimed a bride's prestigious connections. A notably meager offering might suggest hasty familial divestment, possibly due to concerning personality traits or troubling tendency toward questioning male authority. As the bride, you seldom maintained independent control over your dowry after marriage. It became seamlessly incorporated into the household economy under your husband's management, theoretically protected by law, and hopefully not squandered on dice games and overpriced ale within the first month of matrimony. Should your marriage conclude through death, annulment, or your husband's unexpected midlife spiritual crisis culminating in monastic vows, your dowry could theoretically revert to your possession, though retrieving it often proved more challenging than extracting Excalibur from stone. Success required substantial support, legal advocacy, and preferably someone capable of reading contractual Latin. Meanwhile, bride prices functioned remarkably like purchasing exotic livestock, expensive initially and accompanied by stringent no-return policies. The payment primarily compensated the bride's family for her labor loss from their household. After all, who would now milk the sheep, tend the garden, and manage the countless domestic tasks? While love occasionally factored into these arrangements, money invariably attended the ceremonial altar as honored guest. For those deliberately avoiding marriage altogether, perhaps as second sons with limited inheritance prospects, recipients of suspiciously modest dowry offers, or individuals genuinely enthusiastic about pre-dawn liturgical chanting, monasteries and convents offered alternative life paths. Upon joining these cloistered communities, you accepted solemn vows of poverty, chastity, and determined disinterest in romantic entanglements. Yet, even within stone walls permeated with silence, incense, and Brother Anselm's unexpectedly soulful gaze across the chapter house, forbidden love occasionally blossomed against all spiritual intentions. To be absolutely clear, romantic entanglements within religious orders faced severe institutional disapproval, potentially resulting in physical discipline, permanent exile, or interminable lectures from individuals with impressively intimidating Latin appellations. You had sworn to dedicate your heart entirely to divine contemplation, theoretically leaving no capacity for earthly attachments. Yet hearts proved remarkably rebellious against theological constraints, and occasionally morning prayers began suspiciously resembling love poetry with thinly disguised religious metaphors. Perhaps such forbidden attraction began innocently enough, passing bread during communal meals, whispering clarifications during evening prayers, laughing with inappropriate enthusiasm when someone fumbled their hymnal during midnight services. Before fully recognizing what transpired, you found yourself secretly tucking extra cheese into Sister Beatrice's satchel and questioning everything you once believed about spiritual dedication. Some particularly daring monks and nuns exchanged passionate correspondence, carefully disguised as theological ruminations. They crafted letters filled with cleverly disguised passion beneath religious terminology. Your soul shines with radiance, illuminating my darkest contemplations, appears perfectly devout, till one reads between carefully composed lines, which many ecclesiastical authorities eventually learned to do. Inevitably, scandals erupted with predictable consequences. Midnight confessions, proving suspiciously unrelated to sacramental purposes, and occasionally the shocking revelation of a nun with increasingly difficult to cancel rounded belly. Punishment typically arrived with harsh certainty, exile to distant foundations, public penance involving considerable discomfort, or reassignment to remote abbeys renowned primarily for abundant sheep and oppressive silence. Not all forbidden monastic romances concluded in disgrace and separation. Some particularly determined lovers escaped cloistered walls together, a few even securing formal release from vows to marry legally. Most, however, eventually returned to their respective religious communities, suitably chastened and recommitted to spiritual focus, earnestly insisting the entire affair represented nothing more than overzealous theological debate concerning obscure scriptural interpretations. Because ultimately monastic life demanded strict discipline, yet humans remain fundamentally human, even when wrapped in humble robes, even surrounded by sacred silence. Sometimes, a single quiet glance exchanged across a candlelit chapel proved more thrilling than any tournament joust or elaborate courtly poetry recitation. So there you have it. Two successfully navigated the matrimonial labyrinth. There was a priest, a celebratory pig roast, and someone inevitably spilled honey-sweetened mead across your mother's single presentable cloak. But now, months or years into this divinely sanctioned arrangement, something feels distinctly amiss. Perhaps your spouse snores with the alarming resonance of a dying musical instrument. Maybe they conveniently forgot to mention their problematic gambling habit before the ceremony. Or perhaps you've simply reached the sobering realization that marrying primarily for land consolidation and sheep acquisition doesn't automatically produce romantic bliss. Welcome, then, to the surprisingly complex world of medieval marital disappointment. Don't waste time searching for divorce documentations. Such papers simply don't exist, at least not in any form resembling modern concepts. Marriage represented a sacred, ostensibly unbreakable bond, officially approved by ecclesiastical authorities, directly sealed through divine intervention, and enforced through relentless community surveillance and public shame. You might attempt securing an annulment, but this required presenting extraordinarily compelling grounds. We find each other insufferable, carried absolutely no canonical weight. Instead, you needed to prove one party was underage at marriage, already married elsewhere, surprisingly common, too closely related by blood or marriage, disturbingly frequent, or in the most promising scenarios, that the marriage remained unconsummated, a fact requiring formal confirmation in writing, possibly under sworn oath. Good fortune with that particularly awkward documentation. For nobility, marital dissatisfaction presented even greater complications. Your marriage wasn't merely personal arrangement. It represented political alliance with far-reaching implications. Attempting to dissolve such unions might ignite interfamily feuds, generate widespread scandal damaging multiple reputations, or potentially launch regional armed conflict. Far preferable to quietly resent each other while attending separate feast celebrations and maintaining polite public appearances. So what practical options remained for chronically unhappy couples? Primarily, they endured with stoic resignation. You slept in separate chambers when architecture permitted, sighed with theatrical emphasis during shared meals, and channeled suppressed emotions into elaborate needlework or particularly vengeful psalm recitations. Passive aggression evolved into sophisticated marital communication art form. Extramarital affairs certainly occurred, typically conducted with extreme discretion, occasionally erupting into spectacular public scandal. Nobles maintained secret lovers behind elaborate social pretenses. Peasants developed suspiciously helpful neighborly relationships, raising minimal immediate questions. The Church vehemently condemned such arrangements on theological grounds. Naturally, but this merely taught people to develop increasingly sophisticated methods for conducting clandestine liaisons in barns, forests, and abandoned mills, while attributing any unexpected consequences to God's mysterious providence. For women especially, escaping genuinely intolerable marriages proved exceptionally challenging. Even if your husband demonstrated violent tendencies, or had simply vanished without explanation years earlier, society expected you to maintain loyal devotion, dignified silence, and moderate piety, while subsisting on minimal resources and maximum disapproval. Nevertheless, some couples gradually transformed unpromising beginnings into functional partnerships. Medieval marriages weren't always characterized by passionate happiness, but many evolved into reliable alliances forged through shared hardship, comfortable habit, and the oddly bonding experience of hauling essential firewood through driving rain before winter storms intensified. Imagine this sobering scenario. Your spouse suddenly dies, perhaps from recurring plague, agricultural accident, or particularly unfortunate nocturnal encounter with an aggressive goose. However this unexpected transition occurred, you now find yourself abruptly widowed, and the medieval matrimonial marketplace unexpectedly reopens for your participation. Widowhood in medieval society offered surprising liberation, not complete independence, certainly, but noticeably greater autonomy than previously experienced. For women especially, this status often provided first genuine taste of self-determination, managing land independently, making significant household decisions without consultation, even speaking in public gatherings without being immediately silenced by male relatives. If you remained relatively youthful and still possessed reasonable dental health, remarriage opportunities appeared with remarkable speed, indeed, almost disconcertingly quickly. Formal mourning periods theoretically existed, but practical survival considerations frequently accelerated timelines. A widow controlling property without male oversight essentially represented a walking economic opportunity. Potential suitors materialized with alarming rapidity, some offering genuine affection, others displaying suspicious enthusiasm regarding your dairy livestock holdings. If you were recently widowed man, society practically propelled you toward prompt remarriage through relentless practical pressure. After all, who else would efficiently manage domestic responsibilities and continue raising the surprisingly numerous children you'd somehow accumulated during previous marriage? So you began evaluating potential candidates, perhaps the baker's unmarried daughter with proven domestic skills, or that quietly capable widow who consistently brought suspiciously delicious meat products to weekly market. Romance within second marriages often developed surprisingly sweet characteristics, absent from first unions. This time, you approached partnership with greater wisdom and life experience. You weren't being forced into politically advantageous alliance, you were deliberately choosing someone with whom to navigate life's remaining challenges, perhaps even someone whose company you genuinely enjoyed. Revolutionary concept. Naturally, certain regulations still applied. Ecclesiastical authorities frowned upon remarriages occurring with unseemly haste, while your previous spouse remained barely cold, and widows frequently needed to navigate complex negotiations with extended family regarding dowry return and inheritance rights. Nothing quite captures romantic second beginnings like arguing intensely with your former brother-in-law over rightful ownership of particularly valuable butter churn. Yet despite these complications, second marriages remained common practice, even socially expected. Life expectancy remained relatively brief, winter seasons stretched interminably long, and few people willingly embraced permanent solitude when practical alternatives existed. And yes, authentic love frequently factored into these arrangements, perhaps not the idealized, sonnet-inspiring variety celebrated in courtly literature, but the quieter, more substantial connection built upon shared experiences, mutual respect, and profound understanding that both partners had already witnessed life's harsher realities. So you rebuild your hearth, prepare evening meal together, and embark upon this second chance, not because circumstances appear perfect, but because the human heart remains stubbornly resilient in its capacity for renewal. You've navigated the labyrinth of medieval courtships, survived the contracts, endured the chaperones, perhaps even risked a dramatic barn elopement. But before your heart settles on someone new, pause to consider the most medieval question imaginable. Are you cosmically permitted to love this person? In the Middle Ages, love wasn't merely a matter of the heart, it existed at the crossroads of celestial alignment, bodily omens, and whether your grandmother glimpsed a fox in the misty dawn. Consider astrology first. Before stealing that first kiss, prudent lovers consulted the local monk astrologer. Were your zodiac signs harmoniously aligned? Had Venus wandered into retrograde? Was your beloved unfortunate enough to be born beneath an ill-fated moon? If celestial circumstances seemed unfavorable, medieval wisdom suggested seeking someone less astrologically cursed. Courtship presented enough challenges without the planets actively conspiring against your happiness. Birthmarks carried their own mysterious significance. These curious skin patterns might reveal you as your beloved's long-lost relative, or, more disturbingly, their prophesied executioner. Medieval superstitions embraced such contradictions. Meanwhile, the Church maintained its own extensive prohibitions. Matrimony with cousins, whether first, second, or even fourth cousins, twice removed, required special dispensation, which wealthy families mysteriously secured through generous donations. Consequently, before romance progressed too far, prudent lovers sketched elaborate family trees, sometimes discreetly omitting inconvenient branches. Social hierarchy created nearly impenetrable boundaries. When nobles developed feelings for peasants, society deemed such attachments either divine miracles or moral catastrophes. Cross-class romances remained scandalous rarities, acceptable only when later immortalized as tragic ballads sung by traveling minstrels. And everyday omens governed courtship at every turn. A raven's shadow falling across your path, while contemplating someone spelled certain disaster, accidentally dropping bread at supper while gazing at your beloved. Clearly a doomed connection best abandoned immediately. Protective charms buried beneath doorsteps might shield you from unsuitable suitors, or rivals might plant enchanted tokens to sabotage budding relationships. Love in medieval times transcended personal preference, existing within a mystical framework where everyone claimed authority: the stars overhead, the saints in their reliquaries, changing weather patterns, and that mysterious woman dwelling in the forest who everyone insisted wasn't practicing witchcraft, though she unmistakably was. Yet despite this labyrinth of prohibitions, signs, and whispered cautions, medieval hearts continued loving awkwardly, courageously, frequently against all counsel, because throughout history, the human heart has remained gloriously, stubbornly defiant. Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar may dominate historical narratives, but have you encountered the formidable queen who allegedly severed Cyrus the Great's head and submerged it in blood? Her name was Tamiris, and she ruled not from golden thrones within fortified citadels, but beneath open skies. Her court was the endless horizon. Her army moved like the wind, and her authority stemmed not from inherited titles, but from raw, uncompromising power. Tamiris commanded the Massagetæ, a confederation of nomadic tribes roaming Central Asia's vast steppes. Imagine master archers on horseback, warriors adorned with meaningful tattoos, ritual feasts beneath starlit skies, and justice delivered on wind-swept battlefields. Unlike monarchs who inherited their crowns through bloodlines, Tamiris ascended through demonstrated leadership, strategic brilliance, and an unmistakable aura that warned potential challengers. Challenge me at your peril. Her people endured brutal winters, seasonal migrations, and constant threats from neighboring powers. Yet even among these resilient nomads, Tamiris stood a Parda, warrior, queen, and lawgiver who ruled independently, without a husband's shadow or a brother's guidance. We should acknowledge that most accounts of Tamiris come from Herodotus, the Greek historian whose commitment to factual accuracy occasionally yielded to dramatic storytelling. Yet even if only fragments of his account reflect reality, Tamiris emerges not merely as a queen, but as an elemental force, tempest, embodied in human form. At the narrative's core lies this confrontation. The rapidly expanding Achaemenid Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great, having already subjugated Lydia and captured Babylon, turned its imperial gaze eastward. The Massagetæ appeared next on Persia's conquest agenda. Yet Cyrus fundamentally misjudged the woman ruling these nomadic tribes. Long before the first arrows darkened the sky, before spears shattered against shields, before her son's death transformed everything, Tamiris had begun preparing for inevitable conflict, not from territorial ambition, but from fierce determination to remain unconquered. She defended not merely land, but an entire way of life. And Cyrus would soon discover the dangerous folly of threatening certain queens. Cyrus the Great possessed an almost mythic reputation. Not merely a king, but history's consummate conqueror. A man who could march into ancient civilizations, dismantle empires, as a benevolent liberator. When his attention shifted toward Massagetæ territories, resistance seemed implausible. After all, who could possibly defy the monarch who had conquered Babylon almost without bloodshed? Following established diplomatic protocol, Cyrus extended what superficially appeared a courteous offer, a political marriage alliance between himself and Tamiris. While some might interpret this as romantic overture, Tamiris instantly recognized the proposal's true nature. This wasn't about affection or even genuine alliance. It represented thinly disguised imperialism. Marriage would reduce her kingdom to another Persian province and transform her into a decorative consort queen. Her rejection came swiftly and definitively. Unaccustomed to rejection, Cyrus responded with wounded pride. If diplomatic charm failed to secure submission, military might would suffice. Persian forces crossed the Araxes River, the natural boundary separating his empire from Massagetei territories, establishing strategic positions. Meanwhile, Tamiris mobilized with methodical precision, assembling her warriors, consulting tribal leaders, and preparing for the inevitable Persian aggression. Then came Cyrus's calculated stratagem. Under his general Harpagus' guidance, Persian forces established an abandoned camp, overflowing with wine and exotic delicacies, luxuries rarely available to nomadic peoples. Tamiris's son, Spargopizes, led a reconnaissance force to investigate. They seized the supplies and consumed the wine, fatal error. Persian troops returned precisely when the Massagetei warriors were most vulnerable, intoxicated, and disoriented. In the ensuing chaos, Spargopizes was captured alive. When news reached Tamiris, something fundamental shattered within her world. This represented more than military setback. It struck at her very heart. Her son, her heir, and future of her people now languished in enemy hands. She dispatched messengers to Cyrus with this ultimatum: "Return my son and withdraw from our lands. Should you refuse, I swear by the sun, supreme deity of the Massagetei, I shall quench your thirst for conquest with blood." Cyrus disregarded her warning. Meanwhile, Spargopizes, overwhelmed by the shame of capture, took his own life while in Persian custody. With her only son dead, Tamiris's grief crystallized into something far more dangerous: implacable vengeance. Grief alone can devastate, but grief fused with righteous fury becomes something altogether formidable. When Tamiris learned of Spargopizes' suicide in Persian captivity, something primal awakened within her. This conflict transcended territorial disputes, cultural pride, or even political independence. It transformed into blood-soaked vendetta. Unlike rulers who retreat into ceremonial mourning, Tamiris channeled her anguish into action. She mounted her warhorse, honed her weapons to lethal sharpness, and proclaimed an oath that would resonate through centuries. She would confront Cyrus in battle, ensure his defeat, and guarantee that even in death he would never forget the name Tamiris. According to Herodotus, Tamiris convened her tribal council and issued commands that mobilized the entire Massagetei confederation. Envision the spectacle: hundreds of mounted warriors in hardened leather armor, wielding composite bows and iron-tipped spears, faces painted with symbols of vengeance. Unlike Persian forces, with their disciplined formations, the Massagetei moved like natural phenomena: swift, unpredictable, devastatingly precise. Having learned from previous encounters, Tamiris now prepared her own counter-stratagem. Cyrus, perhaps overconfident from his earlier deception, fatally underestimated her tactical brilliance. She studied his military patterns, patiently awaited the perfect moment, then unleashed the full fury of the steppes. The armies collided in what Herodotus describes as one of antiquity's bloodiest confrontations. This wasn't a battle of elaborate tactical maneuvers or inspirational battlefield speeches. It was raw combat, thundering hooves, clashing metal, and a warrior queen fighting alongside her people. No bejeweled figurehead directing from safety. Tamiris surged through battle's chaos, dispatching enemies with methodical precision. When dust finally settled across the bloodied plain, Cyrus, the great conqueror of nations and self-proclaimed king of kings, lay dead. Tamiris, embracing dramatic symbolism in her justice, commanded that Cyrus's corpse be located. His severed head was placed into a wineskin filled with human blood, a final ceremonial offering. Herodotus records her addressing this grim trophy. "You thirsted for blood, now drink your fill." Whether these precise details reflect historical accuracy remains debatable. But the central fact stands uncontested. Tamiris emerged victorious. She had defeated history's most powerful empire, avenged her murdered son, and ensured her name would echo through centuries, not as conquest victim, but as the nomad queen who humbled Persia. This victory marked merely the beginning of her enduring legend. Aftermath revealed an unexpected tableau: battlefield silence broken only by wind across blood-stained earth. Persian soldiers either lay dead or fled eastward, their legendary king's lifeless body abandoned among common casualties. And Tamiris, she claimed no triumphal procession through enemy capitals, commissioned no victory monuments, minted no commemorative coins. Instead, she stood above her fallen enemy, vengeance fulfilled, yet maternal grief undiminished. Victory, she discovered, failed to restore what truly mattered. The Massageti had achieved more than military victory. They had fundamentally altered imperial dynamics. Cyrus the Great's death reverberated throughout the ancient world like aftershocks from cosmic cataclysm. From Babylon to Egypt and throughout Persian territories, astonishing rumors circulated. Her weapons, tactical genius, uncompromising resolve, and warriors who would follow her through death itself. Yet Tamiris displayed remarkable restraint following her victory. She returned to her people without exploiting military advantage for territorial expansion. No punitive raids into Persian territories, no extortionate demands for tribute, no imperial ambitions. She had not sought Cyrus's thrones, settled power, held no appeal. Justice had been served, her son's spirit honored through vengeance. The Persian Empire could continue its existence, though future emperors would carefully reconsider any eastward campaigns against nomadic horse lords and their indomitable queens. This restraint deserves particular historical attention. Most rulers, having achieved such decisive victory against history's dominant superpower, would have immediately exploited advantage for wealth and territorial expansion. Tamiris, instead, prioritized her people's traditional freedoms over imperial temptations. Yet here, historical narrative begins fading. No further records document her subsequent reign, no royal burial site, no monumental inscriptions carved in stone. Like the wind-swept steppes themselves, she recedes into historical mists. Her legacy as untamed and elusive as the landscapes that shaped her. Historians continue debating Herodotus's account. Some scholars suggest Cyrus perished elsewhere, arguing the blood-filled wineskin represents poetic embellishment rather than historical fact. Yet even skeptical academics acknowledge something extraordinary occurred, some devastating defeat inflicted upon Persian forces. And this defeat came not through another king's armies or established general's strategy, but through a mother queen whose ferocious love for her son fueled one of ancient history's most consequential military reversals. Perhaps her story needed no marble monuments or cuneiform tablets. It traveled through oral tradition, carried across generations by steppe winds. When winter storms howl across Central Asian plains, Some still whisper that within that haunting sound echoes her immortal name, Tamiris. To comprehend Tamiris fully requires understanding the extraordinary people she led. The Massagetæ weren't conventional ancient civilization with architectural monuments, irrigated gardens, or written literary traditions. They represented nomadic warrior culture inhabiting vast, untamed territories east of the Caspian Sea. Landscapes too wild for Persian administrative systems or Babylonian record keepers, their world centered around perpetual movement, survival against harsh elements, and fierce honor codes. Picture the endless steppes, boundless plains where the horizon itself seems to flee from you. Here, wealth wasn't counted in gold, but in living, breathing currency. Thundering herds of horses and sturdy cattle. Children of these lands weren't merely born into nomadic life, they were woven into its very fabric. Before their legs could carry them steadily, they were placed atop horses, their small hands learning the rhythm of reins and mane. Archery wasn't taught as recreation, it was as essential as breathing. Their compact bows, extensions of their arms. Their armor told its own story. Layers of hardened leather and metallic scales, masterfully crafted to embrace movement while deflecting death. Perfect for warriors who lived, fought, and died from horseback. The Massagetæ shattered conventional gender boundaries that constrained other ancient civilizations. Women warriors weren't romantic myths or exceptions. They were your sisters, mothers, neighbors, formidable fighters with calloused hands and keen eyes. When Queen Tamiris raised her blade and rallied her forces, no one questioned her authority or right to command. She didn't need to mimic masculinity or justify her leadership. She embodied the qualities her culture already revered. Her prowess wasn't remarkable because she was female, it was remarkable because she elevated these traits to devastating perfection. Shrewder in strategy, swifter in execution, and infinitely more lethal than most who challenged her. Their societal structure balanced raw strength with an unwavering code of justice. Transgressions faced severe consequences, but never arbitrary punishment. Possessions flowed communally, individual ownership secondary to collective survival. What truly mattered was unwavering loyalty to one's tribe and the demonstrated ability to protect it from threats. While monarchs existed, they weren't divine figures ruling by birthright alone. Power came through consensus, through demonstrated valor. Leaders earned their position through actions that benefited the whole, their blood meaningful only when spilled in defense of their people. The spiritual center of Massagetæ life revolved around solar worship. When Tamiris issued her legendary warning to Cyrus, she invoked the sun as supreme witness and judge. To these steppe-dwellers, the sun represented more than light or warmth, it embodied cosmic order, the ultimate arbiter of truth. Breaking an oath sworn under its gaze wasn't merely dishonorable, it was cosmic sacrilege, inviting divine retribution. Every promise made, every alliance formed, every battle joined, occurred under the sun's unblinking eye. Tamiris, therefore, wasn't an aberration in her culture, but its perfect crystallization. Fierce without cruelty, principled without rigidity, proud without arrogance. Her ascension to leadership wasn't despite her womanhood, but in perfect harmony with a society that valued demonstrated competence above all. The stark contrast couldn't be clearer. While Persian Empire functioned through elaborate bureaucracy and hierarchical control, the Massagetæ thrived through adaptability and freedom. When these opposing worldviews collided in that history-altering battle, the nomad's fierce independence prevailed. For people born to lands where winds howl unceasing messages of liberty, and the endless sky serves as their only roof, surrender was simply inconceivable. Here's the fascinating paradox. Everything we know about this remarkable queen, her confrontation with Cyrus, her son's tragic fate, that macabre blood-filled wineskin stems from a single source, Herodotus. While revered as history's founding father, Herodotus equally deserves recognition as the progenitor of historical embellishment. His writings reveal a man enamored with narrative drama, one who rarely let factual constraints impede a captivating tale. If a story featured prophetic dreams, gruesome vengeance, or queens performing symbolic execution rituals, the better for his audience. How much truth lies within Tomyris's legend? The answer hinges on your willingness to trust accounts written by a Greek historian decades after these events transpired, man who likely never encountered a single misogyny throughout his life. Herodotus constructed his histories from a patchwork of travelers' anecdotes, merchant gossip, and whatever tales circulated through Persian territories. For him, history transcended mere chronology. It was performance art designed to enthrall and instruct. Yet, consider this crucial point. Amid countless potential narratives, Herodotus deliberately preserved hers. In an ancient landscape dominated by male conquerors, tyrants, and monarchs, he specifically highlighted a nomadic queen who toppled one of history's most formidable emperors. This deliberate choice deserves our attention. Examining the tale's remarkable endurance reveals its perfect narrative architecture. A noble woman defending her people, a son sacrificed to enemy treachery, a cunning adversary employing dishonorable tactics, a climactic battle where everything hangs in balance, and a denouement so viscerally symbolic it borders on theatrical perfection. Had you been an Athenian citizen hearing this account from a traveling storyteller, Tomyris would have engraved herself in your memory not because of her royal status, but because she dared challenge an empire that seemed invincible and emerged victorious. Through centuries of retelling, her narrative evolved like living mythology. Medieval chroniclers reimagined her as a barbarian, Amazon queen. Renaissance artists portrayed her blood, spattered and triumphant, displaying her enemy's severed head with regal detachment. She became simultaneously exotic and iconic, terrifying, yet captivating. Yet beneath these accumulated layers of artistic interpretation, something authentic persists in her legend. Perhaps not every word exchanged or ritual performed, but the skeletal structurer queen's leadership, a son's death, a decisive battle, an unexpected victory, carries too much specific humanity to be complete fabrication. Ultimately, Herodotus didn't merely document Tomyris, he transformed her into something transcending historical documentation. While this metamorphosis may complicate distinctions between historical fact and narrative fiction, it ensured something more valuable, her name echoing through millennia, outlasting even Cyrus's grandest imperial proclamations. For while history gradually forgets even the greatest generals, it eternally remembers perfect vengeance. Despite leaving no tangible monuments, Tomyris has haunted imperial imaginations for over 2 millennia. Renaissance masters found in her the perfect dramatic subjecta, woman of power wielding justice with unflinching resolve. In 1622, Peter Paul Rubens captured her in oils, depicting her with aristocratic composure as she contemplates Cyrus's severed head courtiers gazing in silent wonder. Another artistic interpretation shows her standing with regal dignity, while attendants ceremoniously submerged the Persian king's decapitated head into a golden vessel overflowing with crimson blood. Such imagery might lack subtlety, but it achieves something more important. It ensures she remains unforgettable across centuries. In the hands of European artists, Tomyris transcended mere historical documentation. She became a living symbol, a canvas upon which each generation projected its own fascinations and fears. She wasn't simply a nomadic queen. She embodied the perfect dramatic archetype of woman who delivered justice with merciless precision, a civilized savage whose actions made emperors tremble. Depending on the artist's intent, her brush-stroked image might represent maternal vengeance incarnate, the untamed spirit of eastern lands, or the embodiment of incorruptible leadership. Literary circles embraced her with equal fervor. Throughout the Enlightenment, her presence graced countless plays, philosophical discourses, and ambitious novels. Intellectuals engaged in heated debates. Was she evidence that female governance could equal or surpass male leadership? Or did she exemplify the dangers when emotional responses dictate political decisions? Regardless of interpretation, her name remained indelibly printed in the annals of literary history. Yet, paradoxically, her own people, the Massagetal, left no tangible record of their legendary queen. As this nomadic society gradually dissolved into history, absorbed by successive waves of steppe peoples, they carried no monuments, inscribed no stone tablets proclaiming Tomyris conquered here. Her memory survived solely through foreign eyes and foreign pens, preserved by the very imperial mindset she had so thoroughly defeated. Nevertheless, her legacy refused to fade. During the Soviet era, Central Asian republics reclaimed her as their own powerful symbol of indigenous resistance against colonial powers. Monumental statues rose in Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, immortalizing not some bloodthirsty barbarian, but a legitimate sovereign who commanded armies and negotiated international relations from a position of uncompromising strength. Her cultural footprint spans the spectrum from academic to popular media. One moment, she commands digital armies in strategic video games. The next, her leadership strategies are dissected in scholarly journals exploring gender dynamics in governance. Few historical figures demonstrate such remarkable versatility across time and medium. Most striking of all, we have no idea what she actually looked like. No coins bear her profile, no carved reliefs capture her features, no burial artifacts reveal her personal adornments. Yet we know precisely what she represented: unyielding strength, perfect vengeance, sovereign autonomy, and enduring legacy. In a world that systematically erases well-behaved queens from its chronicles, Tomyris endures precisely because she refused to play by imperial rules. She didn't meekly request admission to history's grand gallery. She stormed its halls and commissioned the most blood-soaked portrait ever created. Tomyris stands not as an isolated anomaly, but as part of a continuous lineage of warrior queens. History frequently portrays such women as rare exceptions in male-dominated power structures. But deeper examination reveals a different truth. Tomyris belonged to a long tradition of women who commanded through martial prowess. Before her reign, there was Shamuramat of Assyria, whose historical achievements likely inspired the semi-mythical Semiramis, renowned city builder and conqueror of rebellious provinces. Contemporary to Tomyris, the Scythians, cultural relatives of the Massagetai, buried female warriors with their weapons, their skeletal remains bearing unmistakable battle injuries. Confirmation: these weren't ceremonial positions, but functional combat roles. These women rode, fought, bled, and died as warriors. Her legacy continued through figures like Boudica, the Celtic queen, whose devastating revolt against Rome in the 1st century CE mirrors Tamiris's story with uncanny precision. Like the Massagetè queen, Boudica's military campaign ignited from profound personal loss. Her daughters violated, her sovereignty trampled. Her response was equally decisive. Roman settlements reduced to smoldering ruins. The pattern repeats with haunting similarity. Grief transformed to vengeance, and an empire too blinded by arrogance to anticipate the coming storm. Consider also Zenobia of Palmyra, who, in the 3rd century CE, directly challenged Roman authority and carved her own empire from its eastern territories. She struck coins bearing her own image, declared independence, and forced emperors to acknowledge her as an equal power, not a subject. What unites these remarkable women Tomerists among them isn't merely their attainment of power, but their audacious exercise of it. They led during eras when conventional wisdom insisted leadership was male domain. They wielded authority not as temporary caretakers or symbolic figureheads, but as strategists, battlefield commanders, and sovereign rulers. And while history celebrates male conquerors with flattering epithets, these women often received less generous descriptions: dangerous, unnatural, savage, the unspoken reason they succeeded. Tamiris wasn't an aberration, but part of a global, millennia-spanning pattern of women who ascended during moments of crisis and proved capable of defeating the mightiest kings. Her narrative, preserved through Greek historical accounts and reimagined through modern perspectives, demonstrates that female leadership wasn't historically rare, was simply rarely recorded with accuracy. So, when envisioning ancient warfare, expand your mental imagery beyond bearded commanders in gleaming helmets. Picture instead a queen astride her warhorse, bow drawn with deadly precision, eyes burning with strategic intelligence, and recognize this fundamental truth: Tamiris never stood alone. She represents merely one of the few warrior queens whose legacy proved impossible to erase. Tamiris constructed no permanent palace, commissioned no monumental inscriptions, established no dynasty with imposing walls, no magnificent tomb marks her final resting place, no preserved armor hints at her physical presence, no sculpted likeness graces museum galleries. Yet, paradoxically, she endures with remarkable tenacity. Her legacy represents a fascinating historical contradiction. Her entire narrative rests upon a handful of paragraphs from Herodotus' accounts, undeniably colored by bias, embellishment, and possibly invention. Yet, these fragile textual seeds germinated into something extraordinary that refused to perish. For over 2,000 years, her name has resurged precisely when societies needed reminding that true power doesn't require crowns, thrones, or patriarchal sanction. She has been reimagined through countless cultural lenses. Renaissance Europe cast her as the archetypal noble, savage, and cautionary warning against tyranny. Modern Central Asian nations embrace her as national hero and resistance symbol, especially in regions still processing their colonial and imperial traumas. Her statues now dominate public squares across Kazakhstan. Children recite her story in classrooms. Political leaders invoke her name when speaking of independence and national strength. Yet beneath these layers of symbolism and mythology lies something profoundly human. She was a mother who suffered unimaginable loss, a leader forced to choose between capitulation and survival, a person who, when confronted by history's greatest imperial machine, chose resistance and prevailed. In a world that systematically erases warrior women from its chronicles, Tamiris persists like a blade buried just beneath the soil's surface, eternally waiting to be unearthed by new generations, hungry for narratives of untamed defiance. She reminds us that history transcends the standard catalogue of kings and empires. It encompasses mothers and queens, grief and vengeance, dust and blood. It includes those silent moments after battle when a woman stands alone amid fallen warriors, knowing she has irrevocably altered history's trajectory, but suspects posterity may never fully acknowledge her achievement. Perhaps her greatest triumph lies in her refusal to be forgotten. Without monuments, immaterial, her name still echoes across the wind-swept steppes. Her story continues to humanize emperors, rendering them mortal and fallible, while her legend perpetually whispers its chilling warning, "Challenge me, and you shall drink your fill of blood." The next time you encounter tales of mighty kings brought low, remember this essential truth. Sometimes history's decisive blow comes not from rival empires, but from a queen on horseback, officially erased from imperial records, yet never truly vanquished. Picture yourself beneath a tapestry of stars, where your dwelling breathes with the land walls crafted from pressed felt, roofs sewn from animal hide, and a doorway that frames the endless horizon. Here, in the ancient nomadic world, there are no towering citadels, no patchwork of fields, no monuments of stone whispering to future generations, only the hypnotic rhythm of hoofbeats, the soft conversation of wind-blown grass, and the vast, ever-shifting canvas of sky. For these remarkable cultures, permanence was not merely rejected, it was irrelevant. Their genius lay in movement, their strength born of adaptability, stretching from the wind-swept Eurasian steppes to the sun-scorched Arabian deserts. These nomadic societies sculpted history without leaving architectural marvels behind. Far from being aimless wanderers, they were strategic navigators, reading the subtle language of seasons, following the intuitive wisdom of their herds, and developing an almost supernatural connection to the land. Their ingenious homesyorts, tents, and wheeled wagons were masterpieces of practical design, collapsible fortresses engineered for a life defined by constant movement. The true currency of nomadic existence wasn't gold or silver, but breathing wealth, cattle, sheep, goats, and above all, horses. A person's standing was measured not in acres owned, but in animals tended. Horses transcended mere utility. They were simultaneously trusted allies, lethal weapons, and living symbols of status. The equation was simple, yet profound. To ride well meant survival. To ride masterfully meant leadership. This mobility never translated to disorder. Nomadic societies operated through sophisticated social frameworks, with power flowing through intricate networks of clans and tribes. Leadership emerged not through bloodlines alone, but through demonstrated excellence, tactical brilliance on the battlefield, mesmerizing oratory around the fire, or magnetic charisma that inspired devotion. Authority wasn't inherited on parchment. It was earned through action, cemented in councils beneath the stars, and proven on wind-scoured battlefields. Despite their perpetual movement, these societies were far from isolated. They formed the very sinews, connecting distant civilizations. Like living trade networks, they transported precious silk from China, exotic spices from India, gleaming silver from Persia, and unfortunately, human cargo from Europe. These nomadic merchants pioneered transcontinental commerce centuries before settled empires grasped its importance. When peaceful exchange faltered, they pivoted to raiding with terrifying efficiency, swift, coordinated, and devastatingly effective. Their historical record wasn't chiseled into monuments, but woven into memory, rhythm, and voice. Elders served as living archives, preserving through oral tradition the legends and laws that defined their people. A single gifted storyteller might carry an entire tribe's legal system, historical narrative, and cultural identity within the palace of their mind. Their stories weren't mere entertainment. They were simultaneously education, governance system, and collective identity. Settled empires viewed these nomads through lenses of fear and fascination as unpredictable forces, alien presences, and dangerous neighbors. Yet in their own understanding, they were the true inheritors of freedom, virtuosos of adaptation, and rightful heirs to the wind itself, though they left few physical ruins for archaeologists to unearth. They reshaped world history with each thundering ride across the ancient landscape. Long before Mongol hooves echoed across Eurasia, the legendary Scythians commanded the vast, windswept steppe between the 9th and 2nd centuries BC. These nomadic warriors didn't merely inhabit the expansive territory. Stretching from the Black Sea to Central Asia's eastern frontiers, they dominated it. Greek observers saw them as fearsome horsemen and exotic barbarians, but in their own cultural understanding, they were the embodiment of freedom, vengeance, and fierce pride. Scythian civilization was forged in the crucible of constant movement and martial prowess. Their mastery of horse culture reached levels unmatched by contemporaries. Young boys learned the language of the saddle before their legs could properly support their weight. Their arsenal was both practical and lethal. Compact composite bows, perfectly designed for accurate shooting at full gallop. Elegantly curved swords, devastating battle axes, and spears tipped with iron that could pierce the finest armor. The warrior tradition wasn't exclusively male territory either. Archaeological discoveries have confirmed what Herodotus merely suggested: Scythian women fought alongside men. Numerous burial sites have revealed female skeletons interred with complete weapon sets, their bones bearing the unmistakable marks of combat wounds that could only come from battlefield experience. While they built no cities of stone or brick, their kurgans burial mounds have preserved their cultural legacy in extraordinary detail. Beneath these earthen monuments, archaeologists have uncovered dazzling gold artifacts, remarkably preserved tattooed skin displaying intricate artistry, richly embroidered garments, and weapons of exceptional craftsmanship. Their distinctive artistic style, characterized by dynamic animal motifs and predatory mystery. Symbolism reflects a worldview intimately bound to nature's rhythms and the psychology of the hunt. Yet the Scythians defied simple categorization as mere raiders. They functioned simultaneously as shrewd diplomats, sought-after mercenaries, and calculating traders, particularly with Greek colonies flourishing along the Black Sea coast. Their commercial networks exchanged furs, slaves, and grain for imported wine, fine pottery, and luxury goods from Mediterranean civilizations. Greek chroniclers regarded them with a complex mixture of admiration and trepidation. Herodotus documented their more unsettling practices, drinking from cups fashioned from enemy skulls or using scalps as napkins. but also praised their unflinching sense of justice and unbreakable loyalty to kinship bonds. Their spiritual worldview was primordial and animistic, centered on deities governing war, fire, and fertility. Their rituals ranged from cannabis-infused ceremonies to solemn horse sacrifices. Their understanding of existence was fundamentally cyclical. Their connection to the land based not on ownership, but on sacred patterns of movement. Eventually, they faded from history's center stage, pressured by emerging nomadic groups like the Sarmatians, and increasingly constrained by expanding empires. Though the Scythians dissolved into the mists of time, they established enduring patterns of nomadic trade, warfare, and diplomacy that would influence countless cultures that followed. The Scythians embodied the nomadic approach to commerce and conflict, trading grain and gold with Greek cities along the Black Sea, but responding with fire and sword if those same cities attempted deception. Similarly, Bedouin tribes protected valuable incense and spice caravans traversing Arabia, but swiftly redirected those caravans if protection payments went unmade. Even the Mongols, under Genghis Khan, initially sought peaceful trade relations with the wealthy Khwarezmian Empire. But when their merchants were executed instead of welcomed, they unleashed a retribution so complete that entire cities were erased from existence. To the nomadic mind, trade transcended mere exchange. It was a delicate dance of honor and reciprocity. Transactions weren't ledger entries, but sacred bonds. When sedentary kingdoms acknowledged nomads as equals, markets flourished with goods and goodwill. But when disrespect tainted these relationships, retribution arrived swiftly, thundering across plains on horseback, leaving only dust and regret in its wake. This delicate equilibrium created fascinating borderlands, liminal spaces where worlds collided. Towns perched on the edges of nomadic territories transformed into cultural crossroads, part marketplace. Here, city governors discreetly passed silver to tribal chieftains, while nomads traded not just horses, but intelligence about distant lands. Sometimes, these tenuous alliances were sealed with something more permanent than gold. Strategic marriages that wove rival bloodlines together. This perpetual oscillation between commerce and conflict wasn't a deficiency of nomadic existence, it was its brilliance. Through this fluid strategy, nomads wielded influence without the burden of occupation, projected power without administrative infrastructure, and maintained their essential freedom in a world obsessed with permanence. Their strength lay not in conquering cities, but in ensuring cities never forgot their presence on the horizon. Living reminder that walls weren't invincible. How did societies without writing preserve their collective memory? For nomadic peoples, the solution was elegantly simple, yet profoundly effective. They encoded history within themselves. Oral tradition wasn't merely supplementary, was their entire knowledge ecosystem. It functioned simultaneously as historical archive, legal codex, religious scripture, and cultural identity, all carried within the minds of the living. Across the windswept Scythian steppes, through the vast Mongol heartlands, and among the sun-scorched Bedouin deserts, memory was revered as sacred, and eloquence wielded power sharper than any blade. Elders weren't simply respected, they were irreplaceable repositories of wisdom. Their minds contained genealogies spanning countless generations, battle accounts that shaped tribal identity, and proverbs that navigated the complex terrain between honor and survival. These weren't frivolous campfire entertainments, but vital transmissions of cultural DNA among Bedouin tribes. Poetry, elevated to an art form of unparalleled significance. A single, masterfully crafted verse could demolish an enemy's reputation, immortalize a fallen warrior, or resolve blood feuds without bloodshed. Their poets' share served as counselors to tribal leaders, their names often outlasting the chieftains themselves. Their verses could ignite conflict or extinguish it instantly, their memories storing epic narratives, word for perfect word, across generations. The Mongols maintained similar reverence for spoken history. Their monumental secret history of the Mongols began as oral narrative before finally being committed to writing. This wasn't merely a chronicle of Genghis Khan's conquests, but a complex tapestry revealing cultural values and wavering loyalty, predestined purpose, justifiable vengeance, and boundless ambition. It transcends dry historical accounting, pulsing, instead, with the vitality of saga, originally memorized and recited to both educate and unify. Even the enigmatic Scythians, who left virtually no written documents, preserved intricate oral histories detailing their migrations, military campaigns, and diplomatic relationships. When Greek historians like Herodotus recorded their tales, they were capturing merely the echoes of ancient oral traditions. Their history wasn't inscribed in stone, it flickered through firelight, passing from voice to voice across generations. While oral tradition carried inherent vulnerabilities, memories could fade, narratives could evolve, possessed one extraordinary advantage: it lived and breathed. Unlike static monuments or fragile scrolls, it adapted to changing circumstances while preserving essential truths. This allowed nomadic peoples to maintain cultural continuity despite geographical displacement, military defeats, or cultural assimilation. While mighty empires collapsed and their libraries crumbled to dust, nomadic narratives endured not because they were preserved in archives, but because they were woven into the very fabric of breath and memory. As long as someone remembered, nothing was truly lost. While women in many ancient sedentary civilizations lived constrained lives, hidden behind veils, confined within domestic spaces, or sequestered in palace quarters, nomadic societies revealed a starkly different reality. In the demanding context of perpetual movement, traditional gender limitations became impractical luxuries. Everyone contributed to collective survival, and this necessity opened pathways to female power and influence. From the fierce Scythian horsewomen to the formidable Mongol matriarchs, archaeological evidence and historical accounts reveal that nomadic women transcended conventional roles. They weren't merely homemakers, they were accomplished writers, fearsome warriors, respected spiritual leaders, cunning diplomats, and authoritative clan matriarchs. The demanding nature of nomadic existence left no room for idle hands. Every community member, regardless of gender, played vital roles in sustaining life, conducting warfare, and governing the collective. Take the Scythians, for example. Archaeological discoveries across the Eurasian steppe have uncovered something remarkable. Women interred with weapons of war. These graves revealed female bodies surrounded by swords, arrows, and armor, their bones bearing the unmistakable marks of combat injuries. These weren't ceremonial burials or symbolic gestures. These women were warriors who lived and died by the blade. Greek historians, both fascinated and disturbed by these fighting women, wove elaborate myths about the Amazons. Those legendary warrior women, they believed, descended from these formidable nomadic tribes. In Mongol society, women wielded extraordinary influence. While men rode out for conquest, women commanded the encampments, not merely as caretakers, but as administrators of vital resources and decision-makers. Their power extended to the highest echelons of Mongol society. Genghis Khan's daughters and daughters-in-law weren't decorative royalty. They governed territories, commanded armies, and navigated complex diplomatic relations. Consider Sorghutani Beki, perhaps the most influential woman in Mongol history, whose political acumen made her a masterful strategist and kingmaker. She didn't just raise future emperors, she shaped them, brokering alliances that would alter the course of history across continents. Among the Bedouins, though women occupied fewer visible leadership positions, their influence flowed through different channels, through evocative poetry, strategic family alliances, and the sacred traditions of desert hospitality. A woman's tent wasn't merely her dwelling, it was her sovereign domain. Her skillful management of scarce resources, her guardianship of family honor, and her raising of future warriors made her the indispensable backbone of tribal life. In certain tribes, women possessed rights that would have shocked their urban contemporaries. They could initiate divorce proceedings, control personal property, and even own camels, those irreplaceable symbols of wealth and survival in the harsh desert environment. Spirituality also opened pathways to female authority in nomadic societies. Throughout various Turkic and Siberian steppe cultures, female shamans weren't relegated to the margins. They stood as central pillars of community life. These women served as healers, touching both body and spirit, as guides navigating the invisible realms, and as living vessels of ancestral wisdom. Far from being viewed as eccentric mystics, they commanded profound respect as essential bridges between the seen and unseen worlds. In essence, mobility birthed necessity, and necessity fostered a kind of equality rarely seen in the great empires of their time. The unpredictable rhythms of nomadic existence demanded adaptability above all else. When death claimed a man in battle, there was no elaborate ceremony of succession. A woman simply stepped into the void, taking up both responsibility and authority. In these wind-swept societies, a woman could simultaneously rock the cradle and draw the bow with deadly precision. For nomadic peoples, spirituality wasn't confined to temple walls or sacred buildings. It breathed in the land, sky, and the journey itself. When your entire existence is defined by movement, your gods must travel alongside you. Nomadic belief systems typically embraced animism and nature worship, deeply intertwined with seasonal cycles, animal behavior, and the rhythms of survival itself. The wind wasn't merely weather, it carried messages. Mountains stood as silent guardians, rivers flowed with spirits, fire burned with sacred significance. Life unfolded as a continuous dialogue with unseen forces. Among the Scythians, as described by Herodotus, worship centered around a pantheon of deities intimately connected to the natural world. Tabidi, goddess of the hearth, likely equivalent to the Greek Hestia, and Papaios, the sky god, reigned supreme. Their rituals often featured horse sacrifices, cannabis smoke rituals, and solemn oaths sworn beneath the endless sky. Their spiritual universe was visceral and immediate, requiring no ornate temples or priestly hierarchies, only warriors and shamans calling directly to the heavens. Before Islam's arrival, Bedouin spiritual life revolved around a complex polytheism centered on local deities and tribal idols. Yet, above all, they revered the mysterious, the unseen forces governing fate and nature. They believed jinn spirits dwelled within rocks, whirling sandstorms, and desolate places. Their poets and seers weren't merely entertainers, but vessels of inspiration, sometimes believed to be possessed by these supernatural entities. For Bedouins, hospitality transcended mere custom. It was a spiritual obligation, binding host and guest in sacred trust. In Mongol culture, the spiritual universe orbited around Tengrism, the worship of Tengri, the eternal blue sky. Tengri wasn't a deity confined to temples. He was the vast sky itself, omnipresent, watchful, and the ultimate judge of human affairs. Genghis Khan himself claimed divine mandate, insisting his right to rule flowed directly from Tengri's will. Alongside sky worship, Mongols venerated earth spirits, ancestral ghosts, and the sacred fire burning at every tense heart. Shamanism permeated every aspect of life. Shamans served not only as healers and spirit guides, but as political advisors whose visions could alter imperial decisions. The striking beauty of nomadic spirituality lay in its remarkable adaptability. As nomads encountered Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and other settled peoples, they often seamlessly integrated these new beliefs with their ancient traditions. Mongol emperors famously patronized multiple religions simultaneously. A Bedouin might observe Islamic law while preserving older, desert-rooted practices, while settled civilizations built imposing temples to contain the divine. Nomads carried their sacred traditions with them. Their gods moved, their rituals adapted, and their beliefs flowed like the rivers they crossed. For a nomad, faith required no elaborate structures, only sky above, earth below, and memory between. They left no pyramids or cathedrals. Their capitals appear on no modern maps. Yet the legacy of ancient nomadic cultures is indelibly written across history, in trade routes, conquest, patterns, and even the languages we speak today. Nomads weren't footnotes to history. They were its architects of disruption, reshaping entire continents through their mastery of movement. The Silk Road wasn't merely a trade route for luxury goods. It was a highway built by hooves, maintained through the diplomacy, muscle, and regional knowledge of nomadic tribes. Without them, East and West might never have connected. Empires feared nomadic peoples for good reason. The Scythians, Xiongnu, Turks, and Mongols all challenged the fundamental assumption of urban superiority. Their victories revealed a profound truth. Mobility could outmaneuver monuments. Where empires moved ponderously, nomads adapted swiftly. When cities relied on walls, nomads relied on speed. Yet their influence extended far beyond military conquest. They served as cultural bridges, transporting music, recipes, stories, and even religious ideas across vast distances. Mongol rule brought Chinese printing technology to Persia. Arab Bedouin traditions profoundly shaped early Islamic civilization. From jurisprudence and linguistics to poetry and honor codes, Turkish nomadic peoples laid the foundation for the Ottoman Empire. The paths they traversed became the arteries of civilization itself. Even after their empires faded, their spirit endured. You can glimpse it in modern horsemanship traditions, in oral storytelling cultures, and in the enduring values of kinship, resilience, and independence that still echo across steppe, desert, and tundra. They serve as a powerful reminder that no structure is permanent, not even the grandest empire. They proved that the wind could erase borders, and that true power didn't require stone monuments to exert its influence. Today, nomadic peoples persist, though diminished in numbers and increasingly pressured by modern borders, climate change, and urbanization. Yet their descendants carry traditions older than most nation-states: hospitality to strangers, reverence for animals, and stories that travel through generations, like horses moving through morning mist. When studying history, don't limit your gaze to walls, temples, and thrones. Look between them. That's where the nomads lived, and that's where history truly moved. In the mid-1800s, America stood divided, not merely by politics, but by the very land itself. The eastern seaboard hummed with cities, factories, and bustling ports. The western frontier stretched as a wild expanse of towering mountains, scorching deserts, and glittering gold fields. Between these worlds lay over 1,700 miles of untamed wilderness. Traveling from New York to California meant either weeks at sea, navigating the treacherous waters around Cape Horn, or months in a wagon train, facing disease, bandits, and the merciless dust of the plains. Yet the dream persisted, a railroad that would bind the nation together, one steel rail after another. A direct line from Atlantic to Pacific seemed unthinkable to some, inevitable to others. Visionaries saw more than tracks. They envisioned a unified republic with accelerated communication, rapid military deployment, untapped markets, and a settled frontier. Building this dream would demand more than mere ambition. It would require vast capital, thousands of laborers, immense tracts of land, and formidable political will. That final piece fell into place during the Civil War. In 1862, even as the nation tore itself apart in bloody conflict, Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act into law. This momentous legislation authorized two railroad companies, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, to begin construction from opposite ends of the continent. The Union Pacific would drive westward from Omaha, Nebraska, while the Central Pacific would push eastward from Sacramento, California. Somewhere in the vast American interior, these iron roads would meet. To fuel this monumental undertaking, the federal government offered unprecedented incentives. For every mile of track successfully laid, each company received up to 640 acres of public land alongside generous government loans. This wasn't merely a race to connect a nation. It was a scramble to claim land, secure wealth, and inscribe names in the annals of history. On blueprints and in boardrooms, the Transcontinental Railroad represented an engineering marvel. In reality, it would become one of the most grueling construction efforts ever undertaken on American soil. Workers would blast pathways through mountain ranges, bridge yawning chasms, and endure winters that froze breath and summers that scorched skin. Thousands of immigrants and laborers would be recruited, their sweat and blood becoming the invisible mortar of national unity. The rewards would indeed be monumental, but so would the human cost. And for the indigenous nations whose ancestral lands lay in the path of the advancing rails, this symbol of American progress cast a long, dark shadow of warning. In 1862, the Transcontinental Railroad remained a breathtaking gamble. Yet within 7 short years, 2 steel lifelines would meet in the Utah desert, forever transforming the American experience. While the Union Pacific had the relative advantage of beginning across the flat expanses of Nebraska, the Central Pacific confronted a nightmare from their very first mile. The formidable Sierra Nevada mountains. These weren't gentle foothills, but imposing granite titans, notorious for catastrophic avalanches, impenetrable snowdrifts, and terrain that broke both backs and spirits. And this monumental challenge came before the invention of dynamite. that future revolution in mountain engineering. Construction began in Sacramento in 1863, but the true challenge loomed just 80 miles east, the formidable Sierra Nevada mountains. These weren't gentle slopes, but massive granite sentinels, standing like ancient guardians against human ambition. Every yard of track laid was a battle against nature's most imposing fortress. To breach this stony wall, the Central Pacific needed an army of laborers. Initially, they recruited Irish immigrants and white workers, but faced with the mountain's merciless conditions, many abandoned their posts, retreating from what seemed an impossible task. In this moment of crisis, the company turned to a solution that would forever change the railroad's destiny: Chinese immigrants. By 1865, over 10,000 Chinese laborers formed the backbone of the Central Pacific, workforce comprising more than 80% of their labor force. Though paid less than their white counterparts, forced into dangerous living conditions, and subjected to relentless racism. These workers demonstrated remarkable resilience. Their skill, discipline, and sheer determination proved not merely valuable, but absolutely essential to the railroad's progress. The work these men performed bordered on the mythic equal parts heroism and horror. Armed with only rudimentary hand tools and volatile black powder, they carved tunnels through solid granite mountainsides. The notorious Tunnel Number 6 became their greatest challenge, demanding nearly 2 years of back-breaking labor. Winter brought snowdrifts towering 40 feet high, burying work camps completely. Workers lived in snow caves, connected by chimney-like shafts to the surface, emerging daily into a frozen world. Avalanches, accidental explosions, and sudden rock slides claimed dozens of lives. Yet somehow, impossibly, the steel path continued to advance. In perhaps their most daring feat, Chinese workers were suspended in woven baskets over sheer cliff faces, dangling hundreds of feet above jagged rocks as they chiseled handholds into the mountainside inch by precious inch. When mountains couldn't be circumvented, they tunneled straight through. When valleys couldn't be filled, they constructed breathtaking wooden trestles that seemed to float above the abyss. This was engineering accomplished through pure human endurance, one of the most dangerous and woefully unrecognized achievements in American history. Though few records preserve individual names and no monuments honored them at the time, the truth remains. Without these Chinese laborers, America's transcontinental dream would have perished in the Sierra Nevada's icy grip. By 1867, the Central Pacific finally emerged from the mountain gauntlet into the Nevada desert. Though the terrain ahead was harsh and unforgiving, scorched by day, frozen by night, it was blessedly flat. The worst obstacles had been conquered. The race toward the meeting point accelerated with newfound urgency. Meanwhile, 1,000 miles east, the Union Pacific faced an entirely different challenge. From Omaha, Nebraska, their tracks stretched westward across the Great Plains, a seemingly endless expanse of grassland that appeared deceptively simple to traverse. But here, the true obstacles weren't geographical, but human. The challenge wasn't conquering nature, but navigating a complex web of people, politics, and competing claims to power. The Union Pacific's workforce consisted primarily of Irish immigrants, Civil War veterans, and recently freed African Americans. Many workers were former soldiers seeking stable employment after years of bloody conflict. On these open plains, crews could lay astonishing distances of track 2, sometimes even 3 miles in a single day. But this rapid progress came with its own dangers. The exposed terrain left workers vulnerable to raids, starvation, and the plains' notorious weather extremes that could shift from blistering heat to killing frost in hours. This was not empty land, but the ancestral territory of the Pawnee, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Lakota Sioux nations, who had lived, hunted, and died on these plains for countless generations. To these peoples, the railroad represented not progress, but invasion and iron serpents slicing through sacred hunting grounds. The thundering locomotives scattered precious buffalo herds, telegraph poles, and surveyor stakes desecrated places of spiritual significance. The railroad wasn't merely infrastructure, it was the harbinger of their world's end. The indigenous nations foresaw what trailed behind the locomotive's smoke: settlers, soldiers, fences, and eventual displacement from their homelands. Resistance wasn't just inevitably, was essential. Under leaders like the formidable Red Cloud, Lakota Sioux warriors mounted fierce opposition. They raided construction camps, ambushed surveying parties, and systematically dismantled stretches of newly laid track. The U.S. government responded by militarizing the entire construction effort, building fortified outposts along the route and assigning armed troops to guard workers. What had begun as a transportation project transformed into a slow-burning war fought with rifles, treaties signed and broken, and an undercurrent of cultural devastation. For the indigenous nations, the railroad's advance spelled the death of their traditional way of life, a prediction that would prove tragically accurate. Despite this resistance, the Union Pacific pushed relentlessly forward, propelled by massive federal loans and guided by ambitious financiers like Thomas Durant. The company laid track at breakneck pace across the contested plains. Behind this advancing line sprouted notorious temporary settlements known as Hell on Wheels, makeshift towns that materialized overnight and vanished just as quickly when the tracks moved on. These mobile communities teemed with gambling halls, whiskey tents, and brothels, creating cyclones of vice and violence that followed the workers like the very dust kicked up by their labor. By 1867, the Union Pacific had reached Cheyenne and set its sights on Wyoming. While the physical mountains loomed on the distant horizon, the company faced a more profound question. How does one unite a nation with steel rails when those very rails are being laid across the sovereign territory of other nations? For the Union Pacific leadership, the uncomfortable answer was simple and ruthless. Lay the track, claim progress, and never look back at what tonned who was being lost beneath the ties. Beneath the polished veneer of historical textbooks lies the untold saga of the transcontinental railroad, a tale of golden spikes and gentlemen in top hats, but a narrative drenched in sweat, sinew, and sacrifice. The true architects of this American marvel were men whose names history failed to preserve, whose final resting places bear no markers, and whose stories remain entombed beneath the very tracks they laid with their bleeding hands. Along the Central Pacific's treacherous route, Chinese laborers performed the seemingly impossible. Nearly 15,000 souls, primarily from Guangdong province, confronted the Sierra Nevada's merciless, terrain-enduring, bone-shattering cold, deadly nitroglycerin blasts, and venomous racial prejudice. Despite receiving meager wages, inhabiting segregated camps of deplorable quality, and facing constant discrimination, these workers persevered with quiet determination and unmatched skill. When skeptics had dismissed them as frail and unsuitable, These Chinese crews emerged as the railroad's most dependable workforce, blasting through granite mountains, setting rails with precision, engineering sturdy trestles, and maintaining their health through self-sufficient cooking practices. Yet, when the historic Golden Spike ceremony unfolded at Promontory Point, these essential builders were conspicuously absent from every celebratory photograph, erased from the very moment they had sacrificed everything to create. The Union Pacific's western push relied heavily on Irish immigrants who had already weathered the devastating potato famine, only to confront new perils on America's vast plains. They repelled indigenous raids, laid track at astonishing speeds, and sought fleeting comfort in whiskey-soaked slumber within rickety, wind-battered shelters. Recently emancipated African Americans also joined these crews, seeking dignity and livelihood in the aftermath of slavery. Like their Chinese and Irish counterparts, these laborers of color remained largely anonymous in historical records despite their indispensable contributions. This multicultural workforce, sexploited yet absolutely essential, constructed a nation's future with nothing but calloused palms, aching backs, and unwavering resolve. The railroad's supporting cast included skilled cooks who prevented starvation, blacksmiths who forged and repaired vital tools, teamsters who transported materials across impossible terrain, and countless supply haulers keeping the massive operation functioning. Though none occupied executive offices, without their collective efforts, no ceremonial golden spike would ever have been driven. American mythology glorifies visionary entrepreneurs and financial titans. But railroads weren't conjured from boardroom dreams. They materialized through the relentless toil of underpaid, marginalized workers who permanently altered the nation's trajectory without any assurance history would acknowledge them. Their motivation wasn't glory or recognition. It was the primal imperative of survival. By 1868, what had begun as a monumental construction project had transformed into a frenzied competition between the Union Pacific and Central Pacific, two corporate behemoths racing toward an undetermined junction somewhere in Utah's vast wilderness. This wasn't merely friendly rivalry. It was an all-out war for territorial dominance, financial gain, and historical prestige. The feverish pace stemmed directly from the government's incentive structure. Each mile of completed track earned the companies enormous land grants and substantial federal loans. More track meant more wealth, creating a perverse motivation to outbuild one another at all costs. The situation reached absurd proportions when crews began laying parallel tracks in opposite directions, fully aware that only one set would ultimately serve any purpose. Work intensified to superhuman levels as the Central Pacific, having conquered the Sierra Nevada's impossible terrain, now carved through Nevada and Utah's punishing deserts. Simultaneously, Union Pacific crews navigated treacherous rivers and wind-swept plains while circumventing the Rocky Mountains' imposing edges. In their desperation for subsidies, they even laid tracks through territories they knew would later be deemed unnecessary, a calculated gamble for immediate financial gain. The culmination of this manic construction reached its apex in April 1869, when Central Pacific's Chinese workers shattered all previous records by laying an astounding 10 miles of track in a single day, a feat that remains unmatched in railroad construction, even with modern technology. This miracle of human endurance was achieved through meticulously choreographed teams working in continuous rotation, a symphony of labor perfected through years of brutal experience. Union Pacific crews pushed with equal determination from the east, despite crippling labor disputes, logistical nightmares, and the questionable leadership of Thomas Durant, whose passion for financial manipulation far exceeded his interest in actual railroad engineering. As the two rail lines finally converged near Promontory Summit in Utah Territory, surveyors calculated the precise meeting point. Elaborate preparations ensued for what would become one of America's most iconic ceremonies. The company's respective locomotives, Central Pacific's Jupiter and Union Pacific's number 119, were positioned face to face, their cowcatchers nearly touching in symbolic union. Corporate executives crafted grandiose speeches. A commemorative golden spike was specially commissioned, and telegraph wires were ingeniously configured to transmit the final hammer strikes instantaneously across the nation. Yet beneath this carefully orchestrated celebration lurked an uncomfortable truth. The race had been conducted with reckless abandon, driven almost exclusively by profit motives rather than sound engineering or human consideration. Though the rails now formed a continuous path across the continent, the profound scars left on landscapes, laborers, and indigenous communities would endure for generations. For these railroad titans, progress was measured by a finish line they would cross at any cost, trampling lives, ethics, and futures in their relentless pursuit of wealth and glory. As dawn broke on May 10, 1869, the desolate, wind-carved plains of Promontory Summit, Utah transformed into the beating heart of a nation reborn. There, under a vast sky, history awaited. Workers with weathered hands, officials in pristine attire, journalists clutching notebooks, and railroad magnates with ambitious eyes gathered to witness what many had deemed impossible, the marriage of East and West through iron and determination. The Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads, rivals in a race across a continent, were about to become one unbroken line. Like mechanical sentinels, two gleaming locomotives faced each other on the freshly laid track, the Central Pacific's Jupiter, resplendent in its colors, and the Union Pacific's number 119, its polished brass catching the morning light. Between these iron giants lay a gap of final rail waiting for its destiny. At its center rested a spike unlike any other, cast in gold and bearing the solemn inscription, "May God continue the unity of our country," as this railroad unites the two great oceans of the world. These words, etched in precious metal, carried the weight of a nation's hopes. In a stroke of technological brilliance, telegraph wires had been ingeniously connected to the ceremonial hammer, transforming each strike into an electric pulse that would announce this moment to a waiting nation. As Leland Stanford, representing the Central Pacific, lifted the sledgehammer toward the heavens, Americans from Maine to California collectively held their breath. With each resounding blow, the telegraph clicked its message across copper veins. Done. The response was immediate, and thunderous church bells pealed their approval. Cannons roared in salute, and cities erupted in jubilation from the crowded streets of New York to the hills of San Francisco. In that singular moment, a nation still nursing wounds of civil strife felt its fragmented parts knit together. The East and West, once separated by months of perilous journey, now stood merely 7 days apart, connected by the miracle of steam and steel. The engineering marvel was complete. America now stretched unbroken from Atlantic to Pacific, bound not by parchment promises, but by tangible rails that could be touched, traveled, and trusted. The symbolic weight of this achievement resonated deeply in the American consciousness. a young republic, still bandaging the wounds of fratricidal conflict, had demonstrated its capacity to unite its most distant shores and forge ahead into an industrial future. The impossible had been rendered possible through human ingenuity and stubborn perseverance. Yet beneath this triumphant narrative lurked uncomfortable truths. The official photographs captured that day reveal a glaring absence none of the thousands of Chinese laborers who had conquered the Sierra Nevada through blizzards, avalanches, and precarious cliff-face drilling appeared in a single frame. These men, who had laid more track than any other crew and solved engineering problems that had confounded experts, were deliberately excluded from the ceremony that celebrated their accomplishment. Similarly absent were the Irish laborers, who had endured brutal prairie conditions, the freedmen seeking dignity in post-emancipation labor, and the native guides whose knowledge had made the route possible. Instead, the photographic record shows only bearded dignitaries in formal attire, clutching cigars and hammers, the financiers and managers, not the builders. So while telegraph wires hummed with news of national unification, the reality on the ground told a more nuanced story. The railroad, indeed, connected east to west in an unprecedented physical bond, but it simultaneously deepened fissures between races, classes, and cultures. It unified markets while dividing communities. It created wealth while exploiting labor. The carefully staged photographs at Promontory Summit captured the sanctioned version of history, while the fuller, more complex truth lay buried beneath the very crosties supporting the celebrated rails. The Transcontinental Railroad didn't merely shrink. America's geography unleashed an economic transformation of staggering proportions. Almost overnight, the United States shed its identity as a disjointed collection of coastal settlements with a wild interior. In its place emerged a cohesive economic colossus, pulsating with commerce and possibility. Goods that had once languished for months aboard creaking ships rounding Cape Horn or in plodding wagon trains now streamed from coast to coast in less than a week. The agricultural bounty of America's heartland golden wheat, endless corn, and vast herds of cattle suddenly found eager markets in every direction. Farmers could ship their harvests westward to feed hungry mining camps carved into mountainsides, or eastward to satisfy the appetites of burgeoning industrial cities. In the opposite direction flowed the products of America's factories, tools, textiles, and technologies that transformed frontier life. The age of oxen-drawn prairie schooners and wind-dependent sailing vessels gave way to the certainty of steam power and the precision of scheduled deliveries. The untamed frontier, once defined by its unpredictability, was rapidly recast as a series of calculable supply chain nodes. Along the iron path, communities materialized as if conjured by some industrial sorcery. These railroad towns emerged with astonishing speeds, some blossoming into permanent cities, others flickering briefly before vanishing when the economic winds shifted or the tracks were rerouted. Yet each settlement, whether lasting or transient, formed a crucial junction in an expanding web of commerce. Their existence, marked by the rhythmic language of steam whistles, pounding pistons, and coal smoke. The railroad's hunger for materials sparked industrial growth on an unprecedented scale. Iron foundries glowed day and night, coal mines burrowed deeper into the earth, and timber mills devoured forests to satisfy the insatiable appetite for rails, ties, trestles, and fuel. This cascade of demand created employment across sectors and regions, from Pennsylvania steel mills to Rocky Mountain coal mines. the financial beneficiaries formed a new American aristocracy. Railroad magnates, like Cornelius Vanderbilt, amassed fortunes that would humble European royalty. Financiers grew fat on railroad bonds, and a new generation of entrepreneurs established themselves along the rail corridors, opening establishments from humble general stores to opulent hotels. The effects reached beyond commerce into the fabric of American life. Mail that once took weeks now arrived in days, bringing families closer despite physical distance. News raced across time zones, creating a shared national consciousness where events in San Francisco could influence decisions in Boston almost immediately. The federal government, previously limited in its reach, could now project authority across the entire continent, dispatching troops, officials, and policies wherever the rails extended. Perhaps most profoundly, the railroad reshaped human migration patterns. Immigrants from across Europe who had traditionally clustered in East Coast cities now dispersed westward, following opportunities along the rail lines. A Swedish family arriving in New York might find themselves farming in Minnesota within a week. A newly emancipated black family from Georgia could reach the promised opportunities of Kansas in days rather than months. Homesteaders, prospectors, cattle barons, and fortune seekers of every description shared these iron corridors to their destinies. This prosperity, however transformative, was not equally distributed. While wealth accumulated in the hands of railroad executives and Wall Street financiers, the laborers who built and maintained the lines often lived in poverty. Native American nations watched their ancestral territories carved into parcels and distributed to newcomers arriving by rail. The technological marvel had indeed transformed America from a collection of regions into a continental power, but the benefits flowed unevenly through the new arteries. The economic engine wasn't merely transporting goods, it was redistributing power, opportunity, and the nation's future once set in motion. This transformation would prove impossible to reverse. Beneath the gleaming rails and triumphant headlines celebrating the transcontinental railroad lurked a shadow, narrative one of cultural devastation and environmental cataclysm. The Iron Path didn't simply connect America's coasts, it slashed through the ancestral homelands of dozens of indigenous nations, violating territories that had belonged to the Lakota, Cheyenne, Shoshone, Ute, and numerous other peoples since time immemorial. What European Americans perceived as empty wilderness awaiting development had for millennia been carefully tended landscapes, sacred sites, and hunting grounds essential to native ways of life. With methodical precision, the railroad divided these once continuous territories with an unbreachable barrier of rails, telegraph lines, and eventually barbed wire fencing. Each spike hammered into the prairie soil simultaneously drove into the heart of indigenous sovereignty. The physical presence of the railroad represented not progress but invasion, a steel serpent bearing settlers, soldiers, and the machinery of cultural obliteration. The ecological consequences were swift and devastating. The mighty buffalo herds, central to the spiritual practices, economies, and sustenance of plains nations, faced industrial-scale slaughter. These magnificent beasts, which had thundered across the grasslands in numbers that darkened horizons, were deliberately targeted to undermine indigenous resistance and clear obstacles from the rail lines. In a particularly grotesque practice, passengers aboard trains were encouraged to shoot buffalo from the comfort of their rail cars. leaving carcasses to rot where they fell, a sport that epitomized the era's callous disregard for both wildlife and the cultures that depended on these animals. Within a single generation, herds that had numbered in the tens of millions were reduced to a few hundred specimens, hiding in remote ravines, ecological collapse of staggering proportions. The iron serpent brought more than mere tracks. It ushered in a tide of change that washed over the plains. Settlers poured into territories like water through broken levees. Soldiers established forts at strategic points, their blue uniforms stark against the prairie landscape. Surveyors, with their strange instruments, carved the once boundless land into neat, geometric parcels. Towns materialized almost overnight, sprouting from the soil like strange new plants, complete with churches, saloons, and land offices where the earth itself became mere commodity. Homesteaders, emboldened by government promises of 160 acres and a future, drove stakes into land that had never known ownership in the European sense. What solemn treaties had managed to preserve, the railroad's insatiable hunger now consumed, and with each new settlement came the machinery of enforcement. Military garrisons, established not just to protect the precious rails, but to ensure that resistance would be met with overwhelming force. The inevitable collision of worlds erupted in flashpoints across the West. The proud Sioux, the resilient Cheyenne, the defiant Arapaho, these nations and others rose to defend what remained of their ancestral domains. What history books often sanitize as conflicts or uprisings unfolded as desperate struggles for cultural survival. From the cunning strategy of Red Cloud's War to the last desperate stand at Little Bighorn, the railroad stood as both catalyst and prize in this clash of civilizations. But iron and gunpowder eventually prevailed where justice faltered. Indigenous resistance, however fierce and determined, crumbled beneath the weight of industrial might. Entire nations found themselves exiled to reservations, often barren, unfamiliar lands, hundreds of miles from the sacred sites that anchored their spiritual cosmos. The psychological devastation was incalculable. Sacred grounds where ancestors had communed with the divine for countless generations fell beneath plow and rail. Hunting patterns established through millennia of careful observation and adaptation shattered like glass. Nomadic peoples whose cultural identity was woven into seasonal migrations and intimate knowledge of vast territories found themselves imprisoned in fixed locations under the watchful eyes of government agents. All this upheaval, all this cultural devastation was justified with a single sanitized word: progress. The Transcontinental Railroad gleams in American mythology as a testament to human ingenuity and determination. Yet this technological marvel extracted a devastating price to dreams of 1,000 nations. The rails didn't merely cut through soil and stone. They severed the living connection between peoples and their ancestral lands. While textbooks celebrate how the railroad united a young republic, they often remain silent about how it dismembered ancient nations that had thrived for millennia. When the ceremonial golden spike pierced the earth at Promontory Summit in 1869, it marked more than the completion of an engineering project. It heralded the birth of a new American identity. This emerging national character was sleeker, faster, hungrier, and increasingly defined by the cold precision of steel and the relentless power of steam. The railroad compressed America's vast geography into manageable dimensions. Journeys that had once demanded 6 grueling months by creaking wagon or storm-tossed ship now required merely a week of relative comfort aboard cushioned train cars. This compression of space and time fundamentally altered how Americans conceptualized movement, commerce, and distance itself. The notion of a truly continental nation transformed overnight from abstract ambition to tangible reality. The railroad's influence reached into every aspect of American life, giving birth to time zones that synchronized the nation's heartbeat. Agriculture underwent revolutionary transformation as farmers could now ship their harvest to distant markets without fear of spoilage. The Second Industrial Revolution found its lifeblood in the railroads' ability to feed raw materials into hungry factories and distribute finished goods to eager consumers. Gradually, the nation's rhythm shifted to match the steady, mechanical cadence of the locomotive, methodical, predictable, unstoppable. In the cultural realm, the railroad reinforced and gave physical form to the quasi-religious doctrine of manifest destiny, the belief that Providence had ordained American expansion from Atlantic to Pacific. The presence of rails stretching across deserts, threading through mountain passes, and spanning mighty rivers made this expansion feel not merely possible, but inevitable. As the Iron Road conquered distance and terrain, the concept of frontier began to dissolve. Suddenly, every valley appeared within reach, every resource seemed claimable. Every corner of the continent felt subject to the transformative touch of American enterprise. Yet the railroad also established the template for corporate influence in American governance. Unprecedented wealth concentrated in the hands of railroad barons. Men like Leland Stanford, with his mansion on Nob Hill, Thomas Durant, with his financial machinations, and Collis Huntington, with his legislative manipulation. These figures didn't merely accumulate fortunes. They reshaped the very relationship between business and government. Corruption scandals like the Credit Mobilier affair peeled back the veneer of progress to reveal how thoroughly railroad interests had entangled themselves in the halls of power. The railroad's legacy remains as complex as America itself, summarily representing opportunity and exploitation, connection and division, achievement and devastation. For laborers, the tracks offered both employment and brutal working conditions. For indigenous peoples, the rails marked the final conquest of their sovereign domains. For the natural world, the railroad brought unprecedented disruption. Ancient forests felled for ties, rivers yoked by bridges, and the near extinction of the buffalo, whose thundering herds had once made the prairie soil tremble. Yet for all its costs, the Transcontinental Railroad undeniably wove diverse threads into the fabric of modern America. It connected immigrants to new beginnings, businesses to expanding markets, and a central government to its most distant territories. The experimental republic that had emerged from revolution was transformed into an integrated industrial powerhouse spanning a continent. The iron rails carried more than passengers and freight across the vast American landscape. They transported ambition and anguish, innovation and destruction, soaring hope and crushing hubris. The railroad embodied both magnificent triumph and profound tragedy. And when those two locomotives touched cowcatchers in the Utah desert, the reverberations permanently altered the nation's trajectory. America was transformed not by ballot or battlefield, but by the unyielding partnership of iron and fire. Transformation whose consequences continue to echo through our shared history. And now, dear listeners, as the gentle rumble of those iron rails carries us toward the land of dreams. We must bid farewell to our historical journey. Like passengers disembarking from this narrative train, may you find yourself drifting peacefully into slumber. The echoes of America's railroad saga fading into the quiet whispers of night. The rhythmic clickety-clack of history's wheels will return tomorrow with new tales from distant shores and bygone eras. Until then, may your dreams be as vast as the prairies and as peaceful as a moonlit journey across still waters. Good night, gentle travelers of time. Good night.